She owned everything money could buy and lost it all in a single night. Vivian Sterling. Her name appeared on the cover of Forbes magazine 3 years running. Her photograph hung in boardrooms from Manhattan to London. Her net worth exceeded the GDP of small nations. She had never once in her 30 years on this earth needed to ask anyone for anything. Until tonight. Until she showed up soaking wet on the doorstep of a dirt road farmer she hadn't spoken to in 6 years, with tears streaming down her face and less than 24 hours to save everything her grandfather had spent a lifetime building. If you've ever wondered what it looks like when the most powerful woman in the room finally breaks, keep watching. Because this story will show you exactly what happens when pride meets desperation and two lonely people discover that sometimes the most life-changing decisions get made in the worst possible weather. Drop the name of your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button and let's begin. The storm came without warning. That was the thing about late October in rural Vermont. The weather didn't announce itself. It didn't send a forecast or a courtesy text. 1 hour the sky was the color of old pewter, heavy and low and still. And the next hour the wind was ripping leaves off the maples in fistfuls and driving cold rain sideways across the fields like something that had a personal grudge against the land. Ethan Calloway noticed the change from the barn, where he'd been patching a section of fencing that had been threatening to collapse since August. He looked up at the sky, felt the shift in the air pressure in his joints. A farmer thing, something his father had taught him to read the way other men read spreadsheets, and decided the fence could wait another day. He gathered his tools, latched the barn door against the wind, and walked back toward the farmhouse with his head ducked low against the rain that had already soaked through the back of his flannel shirt. The farmhouse wasn't much to look at from the outside. 2 stories, white clapboard gone slightly gray with age, a wraparound porch that sagged a little on the left side where the foundation had settled. The gutters needed cleaning. The second step on the front porch had a crack running through it that he kept meaning to replace and kept not replacing. The vegetable garden on the south side of the house was mostly done for the season. A few stubborn kale plants hanging on, the tomato stakes standing bare like little wooden gravestones. But the lights were on inside, warm yellow through the windows, and he could see the faint blue glow of the television in the living room where his daughter was almost certainly doing anything except the homework she'd promised to finish before dinner. His daughter, Sophie. 7 years old, gap-toothed, possessed of an opinion about everything and a volume setting that only had 2 modes, loud and louder. She'd been drawing horses lately. Horses on every scrap of paper in the house, horses on the back of grocery receipts, horses on her sneakers with a Sharpie marker she absolutely was not supposed to have. She wanted a real one. Ethan had explained, patiently and repeatedly, that horses cost more to keep than his entire monthly income. Sophie had listened to this explanation with the polite, patient attention of someone who had absolutely no intention of changing her position. She was the best thing in his life. She was also, on many days, the most exhausting. He came through the back door, stamped the mud off his boots on the mat, and hung his wet flannel on the hook by the door. The kitchen smelled like the mac and cheese he'd left simmering on the stove. The real kind. Not the box kind, because Sophie had gone through a phase 6 months ago of refusing to eat anything orange, and they'd never quite found their way back to the box. "Soph," he called, "you doing your homework?" "Yes," she called back in the tone of voice that meant absolutely not. He was washing his hands at the kitchen sink, looking out the window at the rain now sheeting across the back field, when the knock came at the front door. He almost didn't hear it over the wind. It came again. 3 sharp raps, urgent, not the polite tap of a neighbor stopping by. Ethan dried his hands on a dish towel and walked through the kitchen into the front hallway, frowning slightly. Nobody came down their road at night without a reason. They were 4 miles off the county highway, down a gravel road that most GPS systems refused to acknowledge existed. Even the mail carriers sometimes gave up before reaching them. He opened the front door. For a moment, he genuinely didn't recognize her. The woman standing on his porch was drenched. Her dark hair was plastered to her face and neck. Her coat, some kind of expensive wool thing, charcoal gray, the kind that cost more than his truck payment, was soaked black and clinging to her. Her heels, which were completely insane footwear for a Vermont October, had mud caked around the soles. She was holding her phone in one hand with a death grip. The screen cracked across one corner, and her mascara had run in two dark tracks down her cheeks that she either hadn't noticed or no longer cared about. She looked like she'd been crying for a long time. Then she looked up at him, and he saw her eyes. Dark brown, the color of expensive coffee. The same eyes that used to look at him across a college library table while they both pretended to study. And his stomach dropped straight through the porch floor. "Vivian," he said. It wasn't a question. It was more like the word you say when something impossible happens right in front of you and your brain needs a second to catch up. "Hi, Ethan." Her voice was steadier than her appearance suggested it should be, but only barely. There was a tremor underneath it, carefully controlled, like a building during an earthquake that hasn't decided yet whether to stand or fall. I know how this looks. I'm sorry. I didn't know where else to go." He stared at her for 2 full seconds. Then another second. The rain was hammering the porch roof, and the wind was pulling at the screen door, and somewhere down the road, a tree branch cracked and fell. "Get inside," he said. "You're soaked." Getting Vivian Sterling dry and warm turned out to be more complicated than it should have been, partly because the only spare towels he could find quickly were the ones with cartoon dinosaurs on them that he'd bought for Sophie's bathroom, and partly because Vivian seemed to be in the kind of shock that made ordinary domestic tasks, sitting down, accepting a cup of coffee, feel like instructions in a foreign language. She stood in his kitchen in her expensive, ruined coat and looked around the room the way people look at places they've only ever seen in photographs, taking in the crayon drawings stuck to the refrigerator with magnets shaped like fruit, the muddy boots lined up by the back door in order of size, the single potted basil plant on the windowsill that was technically still alive. "You have a daughter," she said. "Sophie. She's 7. He set a mug of coffee on the table in front of the chair he was gesturing her toward. "Sit down, Vivian, before you fall down." She sat. She wrapped both hands around the mug and stared into it, and he watched some of the rigid composure she'd been holding together start to crack at the edges. Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, the ones with the horses on them, obviously, holding the remote control and looking at Vivian with the frank, unfiltered curiosity that only children and very old people felt entitled to express openly. "Who are you?" Sophie asked. "Sophie, it's okay." Vivian looked at her, and something shifted in her face, softened briefly, in a way that made her look younger. "I'm Vivian. I'm an old friend of your dad's." Sophie considered this. "Why are you wet?" "Because I drove here without checking the weather, which was very stupid." Sophie seemed satisfied with this answer. She looked at her father. "Can I watch one more episode?" "Homework first, then 1 episode, 30 minutes. Sophie did the calculation in her expression, the brief flicker of whether this was a negotiating situation or a closed one, and apparently decided it was closed. She disappeared back down the hallway. Ethan pulled out the chair across from Vivian and sat down. He looked at her, really looked at her, the way you look at someone you haven't seen in 6 years, cataloging the differences. She was thinner than he remembered. There were shadows under her eyes that suggested a chronic lack of sleep rather than just tonight's crying. Her hands, wrapped around the mug, were not quite steady. "Tell me what happened," he said. She took a breath, then another. Then she set the mug down very carefully on the table, as if she needed her hands free for what she was about to say. "My grandfather died 8 weeks ago," she said. "Edgar Sterling. You know who he was." "I know who he was." Everyone in the country knew who Edgar Sterling was. The man had built Sterling Industries from a small regional manufacturing company into a global conglomerate over 50 years. Hotels, real estate, pharmaceutical investments, media holdings. The kind of empire that had its own Wikipedia page with 17 subsections. He'd been 83 when he died, still going into the office twice a week, still shaking hands and closing deals and terrifying junior executives in ways they would tell their grandchildren about. Vivian had talked about him sometimes back in college, not the Forbes version, the real one. The grandfather who smelled like pipe tobacco and old books, who taught her to play chess on a board he'd had since 1965, who'd sent her handwritten letters every week, even after email existed, because he believed that a letter was a commitment in a way that an email never was. She'd loved him in that complicated way you love people who are also enormous and difficult and a little overwhelming. "He left everything to me," Vivian said. "Sterling Industries, the estates, the investment portfolio, everything. He'd been planning it for years. I knew it was coming. I've spent the last decade preparing to take over, but—" She stopped. Her jaw tightened. "There's a condition. In the will. My grandfather's attorneys found it 3 days after the funeral, buried in a codicil that nobody knew about. Nobody except him." Ethan was very still. "What kind of condition?" "I have to be married." She said it flatly, the way you say something that still doesn't entirely feel real, even though you've been repeating it to yourself for days. "Legally married. The codicil states that control of Sterling Industries transfers to me only upon my marriage, and it specifies a deadline." She looked up at him then, and what he saw in her eyes wasn't just fear. It was the specific, particular humiliation of someone who has always been in control of every room she has ever entered, now sitting in a stranger's kitchen with dinosaur towels and no options left. "The deadline is Friday morning," she said, 9 a.m. Ethan looked at her. Then he looked at the clock on the microwave. It was 9:47 on Thursday evening. "Vivian," he said slowly, "that's 11 hours and 13 minutes from now." "Yes, I know." He sat back in his chair. He rubbed one hand over his face, a gesture that bought him approximately 3 seconds to process the completely unprocessable thing that had just been said to him. The wind outside threw a gust against the house hard enough to rattle the windows in their frames. "You're serious," he said. "Do I look like I drove 4 hours through a rainstorm to make a joke?" "No, you look like—" He stopped himself. "Okay, walk me through all of it. From the beginning." She talked for almost an hour. He poured the coffee and refilled it twice, and at some point found a bag of pretzels in the cabinet and set those on the table between them because neither of them had eaten dinner, and she talked. She told him about the codicil, 3 paragraphs, written in her grandfather's hand and notarized 6 months before his death, attached to the back of a legal document so dense that the firm's junior associates had nearly missed it during the estate review. She told him about her cousin, Damian Cross. Ethan didn't know Damian personally, but Vivian had mentioned him in college the way you mention a recurring headache. Not dramatically, just with a low-grade constant annoyance. Damian was Edgar Sterling's nephew's son, which made him a more distant branch of the family tree, but he'd always believed that his connection to Edgar made him entitled to something. He'd worked in Sterling Industries' legal department for 3 years before Edgar had quietly transferred him to a subsidiary in Phoenix, which everyone understood to be a polite form of exile. But Edgar's death had changed the calculus. "He has lawyers," Vivian said. 3 of them. I found out 2 days ago that he'd already retained them before the codicil was even discovered, which means someone inside the firm or inside the family, tipped him off about the condition before the estate review was complete. Her voice had gone flat and precise in the way voices do when emotion has been compressed under enough pressure to become something harder. "He's been waiting. He thinks if I don't meet the condition by 9 a.m., the codicil defaults to him as next of kin." "Does it?" "My grandfather's senior attorney, Martin Gress, believes the language is ambiguous, that Damian's interpretation might not hold up in court." She picked up a pretzel, looked at it, set it back down. "But court takes time. Damian's legal team will file for a temporary injunction the moment the deadline passes. They'll freeze the assets, freeze the accounts, freeze everything while the case works its way through the system. That could take years, Ethan. Years of Sterling Industries in legal limbo, the employees not knowing what the future looks like, the board of directors unable to make decisions, the stock price in free fall." She shook her head. "Even if I eventually win, the damage to the company my grandfather spent 50 years building—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. "Why me?" Ethan asked. She looked at him. "There have to be men in your life." He felt the awkwardness of the sentence as soon as it started, but kept going anyway. "You live in New York. You run a billion-dollar company. You must know people. Why did you drive 4 hours to Vermont in a thunderstorm to knock on my door?" Vivian was quiet for a moment. Outside, the rain intensified briefly, drumming hard against the roof, then settled back to its steady rhythm. "Because I've known you for 12 years, she said, "and in 12 years you have never once wanted anything from me. No favor, no introduction, no investment, nothing." She met his eyes. "Do you have any idea how rare that is? How rare you are?" She paused. "Everyone else I could call, every man in my network who would even consider this, I'd spend the rest of my life wondering what they expected in return, what they were planning, what angle they were working." Ethan was quiet. "And because you're the only person I've ever trusted," she added quietly, like it was harder to say than the rest of it. "For what it's worth." He looked at the table, at his hands, calloused from fencing and hay bales and 6 years of farming, a few old scars from various agricultural misadventures, a permanent grime under the fingernails that never quite washed out. Then he looked at her hands, perfectly manicured under the smudged mascara and ruined coat. "I have a daughter," he said. "I know. I can't just—" He stopped, started again. "My life isn't something I can rearrange overnight. Sophie has school, I have a farm, I have responsibilities that don't pause for—" "I know." She held up one hand. "I'm not asking you to give up your life. I'm asking for a legal document, that's all. We file the marriage license tonight, we stand in front of a courthouse judge tomorrow morning, we sign the paperwork. After that—" She pressed her lips together. "After that, we figure out the rest. Whatever that looks like. Whatever you need. On your terms. I promise." He looked at her for a long moment. "Vivian," he said, "you should call a lawyer." "I have a lawyer. Martin's been on the phone since 6 o'clock this morning trying to find another interpretation of the codicil. There isn't one." She looked at him steadily. "I've exhausted the legal options. That's why I'm here." The house settled around them. Down the hallway, he could hear the faint sound of the television. Sophie had apparently decided that 30 minutes was a rule that applied to other people. And the wind outside and the rain, and somewhere in the old walls, the house making the sounds old houses make on stormy nights, creaking and sighing like a living thing adjusting to the weather. He thought about Claire. He didn't want to. He almost never let himself do it, the direct thinking about Claire, because it led to places he had carefully built walls around. But he thought about her now. 3 years gone. A drunk driver on a Tuesday afternoon in March. A day so ordinary that he'd been in this same kitchen making a grocery list when his phone rang. Sophie had been 4. Old enough to know something catastrophic had happened, not old enough to understand what permanently meant. He'd done all of it alone since then. The grief and the farm, and the raising of a small human being, and the learning how to cook more than 4 things, and the parent-teacher conferences, and the nightmares that Sophie still sometimes had. The ones where she woke up calling for someone who wasn't coming. All of it, alone. He knew something about loneliness. He looked across the table at Vivian Sterling, who had billions of dollars, and not a single person in the world she trusted enough to call in a crisis, except a farmer in Vermont she hadn't spoken to in years, and he recognized something in her expression that he'd spent 3 years looking at in his own mirror. He didn't say anything for a while. "Tell me about the grandfather," he said finally. Why would he put a marriage condition in the will? What was he thinking? Something shifted in Vivian's face. The tight, controlled composure relaxed slightly, the way it does when someone stops performing strength and just becomes themselves for a moment. "He worried about me," she said. Quiet. "He always did. He said once, the last Christmas I remember clearly, before he got sick, he said that I was the strongest person he knew and also the most alone. That I'd built a life that was impressive from the outside and hollow in the middle." She paused. "I told him he was wrong. I told him I was fine." "Were you?" She picked up the pretzel again. This time she ate it. She looked at the window at the rain running down the glass. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I don't know what fine is supposed to feel like anymore." Ethan nodded slowly. "I need to check on Sophie," he said. And then he stood up. "And then we need to talk about the actual logistics of what you're asking. Because if we're going to do this thing, I need to understand exactly what I'm agreeing to." Vivian looked up at him sharply, like she hadn't expected the conditional to have shifted. "Does that mean It means I haven't said no. He picked up both mugs and took them to the sink. Give me 10 minutes. Sophie was not asleep. She was in her bed with the covers pulled up to her chin and her eyes very determinedly closed, which was the performance she put on when she thought there was a chance she'd get in trouble for still being awake. Ethan sat on the edge of the bed and the mattress dipped, and Sophie's eyes immediately opened because she'd never been able to maintain the performance past the point of contact. Hi, she said. Hi yourself. He pulled the covers up a little straighter around her shoulders. Who told you could watch TV past 8:30? I fell asleep and accidentally watched it. Soph? She grinned, unrepentant. Then the grin faded a little and she looked at him with the serious expression she sometimes had, the one that was too old for her face and had appeared there sometime in the months after Claire died. Is that lady staying? She asked. I don't know yet, maybe. She seems sad. Yeah, he agreed. She is. Is she your friend? He thought about that. What Vivian was to him existed in a category that didn't have a clean name. They'd met junior year at the University of Vermont. She'd been a business major. He'd been studying agriculture and environmental science. And they'd become the kind of friends who talked about real things instead of surface things, who could sit in comfortable silence, who called each other at strange hours when something went wrong. Then she'd graduated, gone to New York to begin dismantling and rebuilding her family's empire. And the calls had gotten less frequent and then infrequent and then stopped almost entirely, the way friendships do when two people's lives diverge in opposite directions. He hadn't blamed her. He'd missed her for a while. And then he'd married Claire and had Sophie, and his whole life had reorganized itself around different things, and Vivian Sterling had become a name he associated with a particular chapter that was closed, until tonight. She used to be, he said. Maybe she still is. I'm figuring that out. Sophie considered this with the gravity she brought to important questions. If she stays, does she get the couch or the other bedroom? The other bedroom. She's not sleeping on the couch. Okay. Sophie's eyes were already getting heavy. Dad? Yeah? Don't forget tomorrow is picture day. Mrs. Patterson said to wear something nice. I didn't forget. He had absolutely forgotten. He filed it away with the 100 other small logistical threads he was constantly managing. Go to sleep. I'm already asleep, she said. And then she was. He sat there for a moment in the half-dark, listening to her breathing slow and even out, looking at her face, Claire's nose, his mother's eyes, some configuration entirely her own. And he felt the familiar weight of everything he was responsible for settle across his shoulders like a yoke. What did he owe Vivian Sterling? Nothing. They hadn't spoken in years. She'd arrived uninvited, soaking wet, with an insane request and 11 hours on the clock. Any reasonable person would have sent her to a hotel and wished her well. But he kept coming back to the same thing, what she'd said about trust. You're the only person I've ever trusted. He knew how much those words cost someone like her to say. He knew because he understood what it meant to build walls so high that saying I need help becomes almost physically impossible, like trying to speak in a language your mouth has forgotten how to form. He turned off Sophie's lamp and went back downstairs. Vivian had found the dish soap and was washing the coffee mugs when he came back into the kitchen, which was not what he'd expected. She heard him and looked over her shoulder. I didn't know what else to do with my hands. Leave them. Sit down. He sat down himself, leaned his elbows on the table. Okay, here's where I'm at. Tell me what marriage actually means in this context, practically. What does my life look like if I say yes? She dried her hands on the dish towel, the one with the faded strawberries on it, the one that had been Claire's favorite, and came back to the table. It means a legal marriage on paper, she said. It means we stand in front of a judge tomorrow morning and sign a marriage license. Legally, that makes you my husband. She met his eyes. It doesn't mean anything else unless you want it to. I'm not asking you to move to New York. I'm not asking you to change your life. I will make it worth your while financially. Don't, he said. Ethan, I'm not doing this for money, Vivian. So don't make it about money, or I'm going to say no right now and send you to the Holiday Inn in Rutland. She stopped. Something crossed her face. Relief, he thought, though it was complicated. Okay, she said. Then what are your terms? Sophie comes first. Always. If any of this interferes with her life, her school, her routine, it stops. Full stop. Understood. I'm not a prop. I'm not going to show up at galas and stand in the background and smile while you give interviews. If I'm in your world at all, I'm a person in it, not a decoration. I wouldn't want you to be, she said quietly. And I need to know, he paused, chose the next words carefully. I need to know that if this turns into something complicated down the line, legally, personally, whatever, you don't disappear. You don't go back to New York and forget this happened and leave me to deal with the fallout alone. Whatever we start tonight, we finish it together. Whatever that looks like. Vivian was quiet for a moment. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Something between careful and raw. I've been disappearing from things my whole life, she said. I'm aware of that. She stopped. It's not something I'm proud of. I'm not judging you for it. I know, that's almost worse. She took a slow breath. I can promise you that I'll try. That I won't just... She seemed to be searching for the language. I know what I'm asking is insane. I know it's a lot. And I know that you have every reason to say no and zero logical reason to say yes. But if you do this, I won't treat it like a transaction. I won't treat you like one. He nodded, slowly. Looked at the table. At the crayon drawing Sophie had made this week that he'd stuck to the refrigerator with a watermelon magnet. A horse, of course, standing in a field that was clearly this farm. And next to the horse, a stick figure with yellow hair, Sophie, and a taller stick figure with brown hair, him. And between them, a smaller horse that was apparently a foal, because Sophie believed that if you asked for something often enough in enough different formats, eventually the universe had to give in. He thought about Claire, the way he always did when he was about to make a decision that scared him. Not asking her permission, not looking for a sign, just acknowledging her existence in the memory of this house where they'd built a life together. He thought about what she would say. Claire had been the kind of person who believed in people instinctively, who led with her whole heart, who would have made the decision in the first 30 seconds and spent the rest of the night figuring out the logistics. She would have said, "Help her, you idiot." He looked up at Vivian. "We're going to need a plan for the morning," he said. "What time does the courthouse open?" Vivian's breath caught, just slightly, just for a second. 8 o'clock, she said, "but Martin can arrange for a judge to be there at 7 if we need it." 7, he said. "That gives us some buffer. What do we need to file tonight to make this work?" She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her phone, saw cracked screen and all, and opened what appeared to be a 17-message thread with her attorney. "Martin says if we can get a Vermont marriage license tonight, the local town clerk can issue one up to 10 p.m. on weekdays." She checked the time. "We have exactly 1 hour and 2 minutes. Town clerk's office is in Whitmore, 20-minute drive. Can we make it?" He was already standing up. "I need to call my neighbor, Mrs. Adler, to come sit with Sophie. She does it when I have emergencies." He reached for his phone on the counter. "Get your coat." "It's soaked." "There's a spare jacket on the hook by the back door. It's going to be enormous on you." He was already dialing. "Welcome to Vermont." Mrs. Adler was 67, a retired school teacher, and the kind of neighbor who had a sixth sense for when she was needed. She arrived in 12 minutes flat in her old Subaru with a paperback novel tucked under her arm, glanced at Vivian exactly once with the expression of someone cataloging a significant piece of information for future discussion, and said to Ethan, "Go on then." The drive to Whitmore was 23 minutes in the rain, not 20, because the county road had standing water in a low section that Ethan had to navigate slowly. He drove. Vivian sat in the passenger seat of his truck, his battered, mud-streaked 12-year-old pickup truck that smelled like dog even though they didn't have a dog anymore, and called her attorney on the cracked phone to confirm the logistics. He listened to half a conversation that revealed, among other things, that Martin Gress had been awake since 5 a.m., that Damian Cross's legal team had already sent a letter to Sterling Industries' board of directors announcing their intention to file for conservatorship of the estate the moment the deadline passed, and that someone on the Sterling legal team, identity still unknown, had definitely leaked the codicil's contents to Damian weeks before the official estate review. Ethan kept his eyes on the road and didn't comment. The Whitmore Town Clerk's office was a small brick building on Main Street that shared a parking lot with the post office and a real estate agency. The clerk on duty at 9:58 p.m. on a stormy Thursday night was a young woman named Andrea who appeared to be catching up on paperwork and looked up with the expression of someone who was not expecting customers. She looked at Vivian's identification. She looked at Ethan's. She looked at the two of them standing on the other side of the counter. Vivian in a coat that was 3 sizes too large for her, mascara-tracked and windswept. Ethan in his work jeans and the flannel he'd swapped back into. And her expression cycled through several emotions before settling on professional neutrality. "You'll need to fill out the application," she said, "and there's a 24-hour waiting period in Vermont before—" "I'm aware of the standard waiting period," Vivian said carefully. "Is there a process to waive it?" Andrea looked at her, then at Ethan, then back at Vivian. "In certain circumstances," she said, "it requires a court order." Vivian's phone was already out. "I have an attorney standing by to file the application for judicial waiver tonight. Can you tell me which judge is available for emergency orders in Whitmore County at this hour?" What followed was 40 minutes of phone calls, paperwork, a PDF sent and countersigned on Vivian's cracked screen, and a very efficient demonstration of what it looked like when someone with significant legal resources and a hard deadline ran into a bureaucratic system and refused to blink. Andrea, to her credit, was helpful and professional throughout, even when a second attorney called and then a third, and even when the fax machine made that noise fax machines make when they've finally been asked to do something. At 10:47 p.m., Ethan Calloway and Vivian Sterling walked out of the Whitmore Town Clerk's office with a completed marriage license application and a judicial waiver that would make the ceremony valid upon completion. They stood on the sidewalk in the rain. The storm had not let up. "Okay," Ethan said. "Okay," Vivian said. They looked at each other for a moment, and something crackled in the space between them. Not romantic, not exactly. Something more fundamental. The recognition of two people who have just crossed a threshold they can't uncross, standing on the other side of it together. "I could use some food," Vivian said. "I haven't eaten since this morning. There's a diner 2 blocks up, open till midnight. You know every diner in Whitmore County? Only the ones that are open past 10. He started walking. "Come on." The diner was called Mabel's, and it was the kind of place that had been exactly the same since 1987. Same laminate countertops, same red vinyl stools, same pie case rotating slowly under fluorescent light. The waitress brought coffee without being asked and took their order with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had seen every kind of person who walked through a diner door at 11 p.m. on a stormy night and had long since stopped being surprised by any of them. They sat across from each other in a corner booth, and Ethan watched Vivian's shoulders drop about 2 inches as the warmth in the coffee and the absence of crisis, temporarily, began to take effect. "Tell me about Sophie," she said. "I want to know about her." So he talked. It was easier than he'd expected. Once he started, it just went, the way talking about Sophie always did. The horses, the drawings, the very specific phase she'd gone through last spring of only communicating in questions. The way she'd made friends with the elderly couple down the road by appearing uninvited in their driveway one afternoon and informing them that their garden needed weeding and that she was available. Vivian laughed. It was a real laugh, startled out of her, catching her off guard, changing her whole face. "She sounds like a force of nature," she said. "She is. She absolutely is." He wrapped his hands around his mug. "She keeps me honest. You can't wallow when there's a 7-year-old in the house. The world keeps moving because she keeps moving, and you either keep up or you get left behind." Vivian was quiet for a moment. "Do you miss her? Sophie's mother?" It was a direct question. He appreciated that she asked it directly rather than dancing around it. "Every day," he said simply. "Not the way I did at first. The first year was—" He shook his head. It was a different kind of missing. The kind where everything is just fundamentally wrong and there's no floor and you're just falling. It's not like that anymore. Now it's more like, he thought about it, like a tooth that's been pulled. The gap is still there. You still feel it, but you've learned to eat on the other side. Vivian nodded slowly. She was looking at her coffee. What about you? He asked. Are you? Is there anyone? No? No hesitation. There have been people, but she turned the mug in her hands. When you're Vivian Sterling, it's very hard to know if someone is interested in you or in what you represent. After a while, you stop being able to tell, and then you stop trying. That sounds lonely. It is. She looked up. I got used to it. That's what you do. You get used to things. Yeah, he said. You do. They were quiet for a while, but it was a comfortable quiet. The kind that only exists between people who have decided, consciously or not, that they don't need to fill every silence. Their food arrived. Ethan had ordered a hamburger. Vivian had ordered the soup and then immediately looked at his hamburger in a way that clearly communicated she'd made the wrong choice. So he pushed the plate toward the middle of the table and she took half his fries without asking, which he found, inexplicably, endearing. At midnight, they drove back through the rain to the farm. At 12:30, Ethan showed Vivian to the spare bedroom. Small, with a quilt his mother had made, a window that overlooked the back field, and a slightly uneven floor that he'd been meaning to fix for approximately 3 years. He found her a toothbrush and a clean t-shirt that was enormous on her, and an old pair of drawstring sweatpants that he'd forgotten he owned. She stood in the doorway of the bedroom looking at this small, imperfect room with an expression he couldn't quite interpret. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah." "Thank you." She said it like it cost something. "I mean that." "Get some sleep," he said. "We've got to be up by 6. He went down the hall to his own room, pulled off his boots, and sat on the edge of his bed in the dark for a long time. Outside, the storm continued. The rain came down steady and cold against the windows, and the old house held against it, the way old things do. Not perfectly, not without complaint, but solidly. The foundation doing what foundations do. He thought about what the morning would bring. He thought about Vivian's face in the diner when she laughed. He thought about Sophie asking, "Is she your friend?" with the uncomplicated certainty that friendship was the most important category. He thought about trust, what it costs to give it, what it means to be trusted with it. He lay back on the bed, still dressed, and looked at the ceiling. He didn't sleep for a long time, and neither, he suspected, did the woman in the spare bedroom down the hall, staring at the ceiling of a small, imperfect room that smelled like an old quilt in someone else's ordinary life, counting down the hours to the most complicated morning of both their lives. Outside, the storm raged on, and somewhere inside the old farmhouse, something had already begun to shift, quiet and certain, the way real things always begin, not with thunder, but with two people sitting across a diner table in the rain, one of them eating the other's fries. Ethan was up before the alarm. He hadn't really slept. 2, maybe 3 hours of shallow, restless sleep that left him feeling like he'd been dragged through something rather than rested. And by 5:15, he was already in the kitchen in the dark, making coffee the way he always did, measuring the grounds by feel because the kitchen light was still too harsh for 5:15, and he'd learned years ago to just leave it off until his eyes were ready for the world. The storm had broken sometime in the night. He could tell without looking outside. The house had stopped its creaking complaint, and the silence was different now, the particular silence that comes after sustained noise, the kind where you can hear individual things again instead of everything at once. When he looked out the kitchen window, the sky was the deep charcoal of very early morning, still dark, but the kind of dark that had already given up on being night. The fields were wet and flat and still, and there was a low fog sitting in the valley below the tree line. He stood at the sink and drank his first cup of coffee and tried to locate himself in the situation he'd apparently committed to. He was getting married this morning. He said it to himself the way you say something that doesn't quite fit in your mouth yet, experimentally, with one eyebrow up, like a man trying on a coat that belongs to someone else. He was getting married this morning to Vivian Sterling, who was asleep in the spare bedroom down the hall, who had driven 4 hours through a thunderstorm and shown up at his door with a cracked phone and no options, and to whom he had apparently decided to say yes because, why exactly? Because she'd eaten his fries? No, because she was the only person who had ever known him well enough to know that he'd say yes, and had been right. That thought sat with him, complicated and warm and slightly frightening, while he finished the coffee. He heard movement upstairs at 6:10. The spare bedroom floor, then the bathroom, then the careful footsteps of someone who didn't know which stairs creaked. He didn't call up. He poured a second mug and set it on the table and waited. And a few minutes later, Vivian appeared in the kitchen doorway in his enormous t-shirt and the drawstring sweatpants, her dark hair loose and slightly damp at the ends, her feet bare on the kitchen floor. She looked nothing like Vivian Sterling of Forbes magazine. She looked like someone who had slept hard and woken up in an unfamiliar place and hadn't yet put the armor back on, and there was something disarming about it, the absence of the composed boardroom version of her. She looked at the coffee mug on the table and then at him, and something in her expression said she'd been expecting to come downstairs and have to perform composure, and was slightly caught off guard by the fact that he'd already anticipated the coffee. "Morning," he said. "Morning." She sat down, wrapped both hands around the mug. Her voice was rough with sleep, and she didn't try to hide it. She looked out the window at the pale sky and the fog in the valley. "It stopped. Around 2, I think." She nodded. They drank coffee in silence for a minute, and it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who had said enough the night before to make silence feel like a reasonable option. "I need to wake Sophie at 6:30, he said. "School picture day. She needs to wear something that isn't covered in horse drawings." A corner of Vivian's mouth moved. "Does she have something that isn't covered in horse drawings?" "We're going to find out." He topped off his coffee and looked at the clock. An hour and 15 minutes before they needed to leave for the courthouse. Martin Gress had confirmed by text at 11 p.m. that a judge would be present at 7 a.m. and the paperwork would be in order. Everything was set, in the logistical sense. Whether anything else was in order was a different question. "What happens today?" he asked. "After the courthouse, walk me through your day." Vivian set down her mug. She sat up slightly, not straightening into the full boardroom posture, but something in between. The transition of someone who was beginning to put the functional self back on, layer by layer. "Martin will file the marriage certificate with the court the moment it's issued. That creates a time-stamped legal record before 9 a.m. She ticked through it methodically, and he could see that this was how she managed things that frightened her, by reducing them to sequence, to steps, to one thing after another. Damien's attorneys will receive formal notification through Sterling Industries' legal department. The board of directors has already been notified that a resolution is forthcoming this morning. I'll need to be on a call with them by 10. She paused. "After that, I'll probably need to drive back to New York. There are things I need to handle in person." "Today?" "By tonight, ideally." She looked at him. I know it's strange to get married in the morning and leave in the afternoon." "It's not strange," he said. "It's just what the situation is." "Still," she looked at the table. It's not how I imagined." She stopped herself. "Imagined what?" She shook her head. "Nothing. Never mind." He let it go. There were things she was still keeping close, and he understood the impulse. He'd done the same thing, for years after Claire. Kept things close because putting them into words made them real in a way that was sometimes more than you could handle before the coffee was done. He went to wake Sophie. Sophie's morning resistance to consciousness was, as always, comprehensive and creative. She had developed over 7 years an entire catalog of delaying tactics. The boneless resistance to sitting up, the sudden need to share extremely detailed information about a dream she'd just remembered, the discovery of an urgent question about something completely unrelated to getting out of bed. This morning's tactic was a stubborn declaration that she didn't feel well, delivered while her eyes were still mostly closed. "Your forehead is fine," Ethan said, having applied the back of his hand to it. "You're not warm." "My stomach feels weird." "Did you eat anything weird last night?" "No." "Then your stomach is lying to you. Come on, picture day." "I ironed the green shirt." Sophie cracked one eye open. "The one with the buttons?" "Yeah." "I don't like the buttons." "Sophie, they're uncomfortable." "They're buttons. They don't do anything. They just sit there." He pulled back the covers in the efficient way that ended the negotiation. 5 minutes. "Bathroom, clothes, downstairs." "I'll make eggs." Sophie sat up with the resigned expression of someone accepting an unjust universe, and he went back downstairs to find Vivian at the stove, spatula in hand, in front of the pan he'd left out. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. "I hope this is okay," she said, not turning around. "I found the eggs. I can cook eggs, it seemed like." She gestured vaguely. "You have a lot going on this morning." He watched her for a second. Vivian Sterling, billionaire heiress in his sweatpants, making scrambled eggs on his ancient gas range, in the kitchen with the crayon drawings on the refrigerator and the potted basil on the window that was technically still alive. "That's fine," he said. "Thank you. I didn't know how Sophie likes them. Soft scramble. A little cheese, if there is any." "There's cheese." He set the table. By the time Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway, green shirt, buttons fastened under clear protest, hair in the two braids that were the only style she'd agreed to since April. The eggs were done, and the table was set, and Vivian was at the sink washing the pan, which Sophie apparently found less remarkable than Ethan had expected. Sophie climbed into her chair, looked at the eggs, looked at Vivian, and said, "Did you make these?" "I did." "Are you staying for breakfast?" "I am." Sophie reached for her fork. "Okay," she said, with the easy acceptance of a child who has already categorized this situation and moved on. "Did you sleep okay?" Vivian sat down across from her. "Better than I expected, actually. The quilt in there is very soft. My grandma made that. She died before I was born, so I didn't know her, but Dad says she made really good quilts." He's right. It's a beautiful one. Sophie ate several bites of egg in the way she always ate. Quickly, purposefully. A child who treated meals as fuel rather than events. Then she looked up at Vivian with the specific evaluating expression she used on people she hadn't decided about yet. "Are you and my dad getting married today?" she asked. The kitchen went very quiet. Ethan looked up from his coffee. Vivian had gone completely still, fork halfway to her plate. "What?" Ethan said. "I heard you talking last night." Sophie was entirely matter-of-fact about this. "I wasn't trying to, but I got up for water, and I heard you say courthouse and married, and I looked it up on my tablet." She looked at Ethan. "You said I could look things up if I had questions." "I meant questions about—" He stopped. He looked at Vivian, who looked back at him with an expression that said, "This one is yours. I have no jurisdiction here." He looked back at Sophie. "Yeah," he said. "We are." Sophie chewed another bite of egg. She appeared to be processing this information with the methodical interior process she applied to things that were complicated. "How come?" she asked. Not accusatory, just genuinely curious. Ethan had spent some version of this moment in his head at some point in the last 8 hours. Had a vague sense that he'd need to explain this to Sophie, but had imagined it happening later, maybe this afternoon, maybe this evening, not over scrambled eggs at 6:45 in the morning. He looked at his daughter's serious 7-year-old face and decided that the truth, simplified but not falsified, was the only option she'd accept. Sophie had a calibrated BS detector. "Vivian's in trouble," he said. "She needs a husband today, or she's going to lose something that belongs to her, something important that her grandfather left her, and I'm helping her." Sophie looked at Vivian. "What are you going to lose?" "My grandfather's company," Vivian said. She answered the question directly, which Ethan noted. She didn't soften it or redirect it or talk around it. "He built it for his whole life, and he left it to me. And if I don't have a husband by this morning, someone else gets to take it, someone who doesn't deserve it." "That's not fair," Sophie said, with the flat, decisive moral clarity that 7-year-olds bring to injustice. "No," Vivian agreed. "It's really not." Sophie seemed to have reached a verdict. She turned back to her eggs. "Okay," she said. Then, "Is Mrs. Adler picking me up this afternoon?" "No, I'll be back before school lets out." Ethan reached over and tucked in the collar of the green shirt, which had flipped up. "It's not going to take long. Can I come watch?" "To the courthouse?" "Yeah." He started to say no. There were probably 100 good reasons to say no, but Sophie was already looking at him with the expression she'd inherited from Claire, the one that made no argument and offered no leverage, just looked at you steadily until you worked out the answer yourself. "Yeah," he said. "Okay, you can come." Vivian looked at him across the table with an expression he couldn't quite read. Surprised, maybe, or something softer than that. Sophie went back to her breakfast, satisfied. The morning moved quickly after that, in the way mornings do when there are things that need to happen by a specific time. Ethan showered and put on the only decent dress shirt he owned, dark blue, bought for a friend's wedding 2 years ago and worn exactly twice since, and found that it still fit if he didn't button the top button, which he didn't. Vivian called Martin Gress from the spare bedroom, and he could hear the low cadence of a legal conversation happening through the wall, terms he mostly understood and some he didn't. Sophie brushed her teeth without being asked twice, which was unprecedented and which he credited to the general atmosphere of something significant happening, children being sensitive to that in ways adults often underestimated. By 6:55, they were in the truck, Ethan driving, Vivian in the passenger seat in the clothes she'd arrived in, which had dried overnight and looked considerably better than they had at 10 p.m. Sophie in the back with her backpack on her lap, wearing the green shirt and looking out the window at the fog-softened fields with the absorbed attention of a child who was taking everything in and filing it away. Vivian had her phone out and was going through something, emails, texts, Martin's confirmations, and Ethan drove and didn't talk. And Sophie, by some instinct, also didn't talk, and the quiet in the truck was companionable rather than tense, the shared silence of 3 people going somewhere together who were each processing the morning in their own way. They were 10 minutes out from Whitmore when Vivian's phone rang. She looked at the screen. Something shifted in her face. "It's Damien," she said. Ethan glanced at her. "You don't have to answer." "I know." She looked at the phone for another ring. 2. Then she answered it. "Damien." Ethan could hear the voice on the other end, tinny through the speaker. Male, smooth, the kind of smooth that's practiced rather than natural, a voice that had learned confidence as a performance rather than feeling it. "Vivian, how are you this morning?" "I'm well. What do you want?" "I just wanted to check in, make sure you're holding up okay. It must be a stressful morning." "Is there a point to this call, Damien?" A brief pause. Then, "I want you to know that it doesn't have to be adversarial. When the transfer of controlling interest goes through this morning, I'm prepared to offer you a very generous consulting arrangement. Your expertise in the company's operations is genuinely valuable, and I—" "Stop." Her voice was flat and very still, the way a river is still right before a waterfall. "I'm going to say this once. You don't have the company. You're not getting the company. Whatever you think is happening this morning isn't happening. And when this is over, I'm going to spend a considerable amount of time and legal resources finding out exactly how you accessed the codicil before the estate review was complete, and what you did with that information, and who helped you." She paused. "Enjoy your morning." She hung up. The truck was quiet for 3 seconds. Then Sophie said from the back seat, "Was that the bad guy?" Vivian let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "Yeah, baby, that was the bad guy." "He sounded like a bad guy." "He really does, doesn't he?" Sophie nodded gravely and went back to looking out the window, and Vivian looked at Ethan, and he looked back at her for 1 second before returning his eyes to the road, and something passed between them. Acknowledgement, maybe, or something that didn't have a precise name yet but was real and solid and had weight. The Whitmore County Courthouse was a squat 2-story brick building on the town square, American flag out front, a handicap ramp that had been added somewhat grudgingly to the left side of the original stone steps. At 7 a.m., the parking lot was nearly empty. Martin Gress was waiting on the steps. Ethan had never met him before, knew him only from the phone conversation Vivian had described, and in person he was a slight man in his mid-60s with a gray suit and the face of someone who had been in legal crises before and had developed, over decades, a settled approach to them. He looked at Ethan with the assessing, non-judgmental gaze of a man who had learned to take the situation as it came. "Mr. Calloway," he said, extending his hand. "Mr. Gress. Thank you for, doing this." There was a weight in the words that suggested he understood it was not a small thing. "Let's get it done," Ethan said. The inside of the courthouse at 7 a.m. was a different kind of quiet than the farmhouse had been. Institutional quiet, fluorescent lights, the smell of old carpet, and coffee from somewhere in the building's interior. A clerk Ethan didn't recognize led them down a hallway to a small room. Not a courtroom, just a room with a table and some chairs. The kind of utilitarian space that institutions use for things that need to happen but don't require ceremony. Sophie had been quiet since they walked in. She sat in a chair against the wall with her backpack on her lap and watched everything with large, serious eyes that were taking in more than she would probably be able to articulate for years, filing it into the part of her memory where the important things lived. The judge was a woman named Hendricks, 60 or so, reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, who accepted the paperwork from Martin with the efficient manner of someone who had agreed to be here at 7 a.m. and was going to do this properly even at 7 a.m. She looked over the documentation, the license, the waiver, Martin's notarized submissions, and then looked up at Ethan and Vivian over her glasses. "This is irregular," she said, not unkindly, "but the paperwork is in order. Do you both understand what you're signing?" "Yes," Ethan said. "Yes," Vivian said. "There are no vows required in a civil ceremony unless you want them," Judge Hendricks said. "Given the circumstances, the standard language is fine," Vivian said. The judge nodded. She put her glasses on. She began. It took 11 minutes. Ethan stood next to Vivian in the small institutional room and listened to words that were, as promised, simple and practical. The legal language of a civil ceremony, the questions that required yes and the signature that made it real. And he answered when he was supposed to answer and signed where he was supposed to sign, and at some point looked sideways at Vivian and found that she was looking back at him with an expression that was complicated and a little raw and completely unguarded, which was a look he suspected very few people had ever seen on her face. When it was done, Martin Gress immediately took the signed certificate to the clerk down the hall to initiate the filing, moving with the purposeful speed of a man who understood that time-stamping this document was the entire point. Judge Hendricks shook their hands and left. Sophie climbed down from her chair and crossed the room and took Vivian's hand. Just took it, the way children do when they've decided something, without announcement or preamble. Vivian looked down at her, startled. "Is it done?" Sophie asked. "Did it work?" "We'll know in a few minutes," Vivian said. Her voice was slightly unsteady. "But I think so." Sophie nodded. She didn't let go of the hand. Martin came back down the hallway 7 minutes later with his phone to his ear, and when he looked up, his expression said everything before his words did. He ended the call and walked toward them, and the faintest version of relief moved across his contained professional face. "It's filed," he said. 8:42 a.m. Damien's team has been notified through official channels. He paused. "It's done, Vivian." Something moved through her. Not an expression exactly, more like the sudden absence of something she'd been holding for weeks. Her shoulders dropped half an inch. She closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then she opened them. "Thank you, Martin," she said. "I'll handle the rest from here. You have the board call at 10. I'd recommend—" He glanced at Ethan, then Sophie, then back at Vivian, and had the discretion to redirect his thought. "We can discuss the next steps privately." "Give me a few minutes," she said. Martin nodded and stepped away down the hallway, already dialing again. Vivian looked at Ethan. Sophie, apparently sensing that this was an adult moment, had wandered to the window at the end of the hall and was pressing her nose against the glass to look at something outside with the focused attention she brought to interesting things. "Ethan," Vivian said, "you don't have to say it." "I want to." She met his eyes. "I know that." She paused, tried again. The composure she'd rebuilt this morning had cracks in it now, not in a bad way, in the way that lets light through. "I know this is strange. I know what I asked you to do is... it's a lot. And I know you didn't do it for me, exactly. You did it because..." She stopped again. "Because you're you, and that's..." She pressed her lips together. "I don't know how to thank you for that." "You don't have to thank me," he said. "I do. I really do." He looked at her in the fluorescent-lit hallway of the Whitmore County Courthouse at 8:40-something in the morning, and he thought about the night before, The kitchen table in the diner, and the drive in the rain, and the conversations that had moved through serious and honest and sad and funny in the way good conversations do, the ones that cover real territory. "Are you going to be okay?" he asked. "Today, with the board call and whatever comes next." "Yes," she said. Then, "I don't know. Maybe." She almost smiled. "Probably." "Good answer." "I need to go back to New York," she said. "I know I said that this morning, and I know it." "Vivian, go. Handle your company. That's what this morning was for." She looked at him for a moment longer than a simple acknowledgement required. Then she nodded. They walked back down the hallway to collect Sophie, who had moved from the window to a bulletin board on the wall and was reading the notices posted there with the earnest attention she brought to anything printed, regardless of whether it was relevant to her life. "Sophie," Ethan said, "we need to get you to school." Sophie peeled herself away from the bulletin board. She looked at Vivian. "Are you going to come to the farm again?" Vivian glanced at Ethan and then back at Sophie. "I hope so," she said. "We have a barn," Sophie said. "I can show you. And Dad said maybe we'll get a horse, but he keeps saying maybe, but I think eventually the answer will be yes." "Sophie, that's called persistence," Sophie told Vivian. "My teacher says it's a virtue." Vivian's face broke into something genuine and unguarded, the laugh from the diner again, and it changed the whole room. "Your teacher's right," she said. "It absolutely is." They went through the courthouse doors into the morning. The fog had mostly lifted while they were inside. The sky was clear and pale blue, the particular blue of early October mornings in Vermont, with a cold edge to the air that hadn't been there a week ago. The town square was starting to come to life. A man walking a dog. A delivery truck idling outside the coffee shop. The sound of a shopkeeper's door opening on the other side of the square. Ethan took Sophie to school first, pulling up in front of the low brick building and walking her to the door the way he always did. Sophie submitted to having her braids straightened one more time, which she always pretended to hate and always secretly accepted, and then turned to go in and stopped. She turned back. "Dad?" "Yeah?" "I think she's nice," Sophie said. "Vivian, I think she's actually nice." Then she went inside, backpack bumping with each step, already absorbed in whatever the day was going to bring her. Ethan stood on the sidewalk outside the school and watched the door close behind her, and felt the specific tenderness of being her father, the weight and the privilege of it that never went away no matter how ordinary the morning was. When he got back to the truck, Vivian was on the phone with her board. He could hear enough to know it was going well. The tone in her voice was different now, the boardroom version of her back in full force, sharp and precise, and clearly in control of the room. She held up one finger when she saw him, acknowledging his presence without breaking the call, and he got in the driver's seat and waited. She finished the call 7 minutes later. She sat back in the seat and exhaled. Not the overwhelmed exhale of last night, but the exhale of someone who has just finished a sprint and is checking whether all their limbs are still attached. "Board is satisfied," she said. "Martin's handling Damien's legal team. The injunction filing they were preparing has been withdrawn." She looked out the windshield at the Vermont morning. "It's over." "Yeah?" "Yeah." She turned her head to look at him. "It worked." They sat with that for a moment. "I should get on the road," she said. "The drive back is 4 hours and I have things. I'll drive you to your car." Her car was still parked at his farm. She'd left it there the night before when they'd taken his truck to the clerk's office, and it had spent the night in his driveway collecting fallen leaves. When they got back, it was a silver sedan, understated by Billionaire standards, though probably still cost more than the barn, with leaves plastered to the windshield from the storm and mud on the lower half of the doors from the gravel road. He found the ice scraper on the back porch and came around to the front of her car and started clearing the leaves without being asked. Vivian watched him from a few feet away. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know." She was quiet while he cleared the windshield. The morning air was cold enough to see your breath, just barely, and the wet leaves came off in clumps and he shook them onto the gravel and kept going until the glass was clear. When he straightened up and turned around, she was right there, closer than he'd expected. She looked at him. straight at him, the way she'd looked at him in the courthouse hallway. The unguarded version of her face that he was starting to understand was what she actually looked like when she wasn't performing anything. "I meant what I said last night," she said, "about trust, about not disappearing." "I know you did." "I'm bad at it," she said. "I want you to know that going in. I'm genuinely bad at staying in contact and showing up," and she shook her head slightly, the honest self-appraisal of someone who has had enough time to know their own weaknesses. "I don't want to make you a promise I can't keep, but I want to try." He looked at her, at the mud on her expensive coat that she hadn't complained about once, at the way she'd made scrambled eggs this morning without being asked and answered Sophie's questions directly, and held her hand in the courthouse hallway without pulling away. "I know you're bad at it," he said. "Try anyway." Something softened in her face that hadn't softened before. Not relief exactly, but something adjacent to it. The look of someone who has been told the bar is honest rather than perfect. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay." She got in the car. He stepped back from the driver's door. She started the engine, then rolled down the window, which fogged immediately in the cold air. "Ethan." "Yeah." "Tell Sophie." She paused. A corner of her mouth lifted. "Tell her I'm on her side about the horse." He shook his head. "Don't encourage her." "Too late. I'm already encouraging her." She put the car in reverse, and he stood on the gravel driveway of his farm with his hands in his jacket pockets and watched her back down the long drive toward the road. At the end of the driveway, she stopped. He thought for a moment she was going to get out, come back, say something else. But after a second, she turned onto the county road and drove away, and the sound of the engine faded into the October morning, and then it was quiet. He stood there for a little while. The farm was quiet around him. The familiar quiet of his own land, the hens in the coop doing their morning commentary, a crow calling from somewhere in the maple trees at the back of the field, the distant sound of the neighbor's tractor on the other side of the ridge. All the ordinary sounds of the ordinary life he lived here, unchanged. And yet something had changed. Something had shifted in the foundation of the last 12 hours, settled in a new position the way settling things do. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, just differently weighted than it had been before. He was married. He turned that fact over in his mind, the way you turn something over in your hands in the dark to understand its shape without being able to see it. He was married to a woman who had just driven away down a Vermont County road toward New York City and her billion-dollar empire, who made scrambled eggs and borrowed sweatpants and laughed when Sophie said something real and held his daughter's hand in a courthouse hallway with no calculation in it whatsoever. He didn't know what it was. He didn't know what it was going to become. He was not a man who spent a lot of time thinking about what things were going to become. Farming had cured him of that, because farming was fundamentally about responding to what was happening right now, today, this season, with these particular conditions. And you could plan all you wanted, but the weather was going to do what it did, and the only thing you controlled was your response. He was pretty sure, though, that this was not over. He was pretty sure that Vivian Sterling, for whatever reason, was not something that went into the past chapter file. He could feel it the way he felt the shift in the air before a weather change, in his joints, in the place in the chest where the things that actually matter tend to make themselves known. He went back inside. The kitchen still smelled like the scrambled eggs she'd made, and there were 2 coffee mugs on the counter that he'd forgotten to put in the sink. He stood there for a second, looking at them, his mug, her mug, side by side on the counter of his kitchen, the most ordinary possible thing, and then he ran the water and washed them both and set them in the drying rack and went to check on the barn. He had work to do. The fence still needed patching, the hens needed tending, the kale in the garden would keep another week if the temperature held. All the ordinary machinery of his life, running on its ordinary schedule, indifferent to what had happened this morning. But somewhere on I-89 heading south, a silver sedan was moving through the October morning with a woman at the wheel who had told him she was bad at staying and had said she'd try anyway, and he had believed her. Not because he was naive, he'd been around long enough to know the difference between what people said and what they did, but because of the way she'd said it, without decoration, without softening, just the plain, honest statement of a person who knew their own failure modes and was deciding, with full awareness, to try something different. He believed in trying. He pulled on his work gloves and walked toward the barn in the clear, cold October morning, and he didn't think anymore about what things were going to become. He thought about the fence, and the chickens, and the field that needed turning before the first frost, and Sophie's homework that she probably hadn't done last night, and whether there was enough milk for the morning. And underneath all of that, quiet as the fog that had lifted off the valley, something that felt not like happiness exactly. Not yet. More like the first sign of a season changing. The particular feeling of standing at the edge of something, not knowing what it is, but knowing with some certainty you can't entirely explain that it's real. 3 weeks passed. Ethan didn't hear from Vivian. Not nothing. There was a text the evening she got back to New York, short and factual. Made it back. Board call went well. Thank you again. He'd replied with something equally brief, and then the thread had gone quiet, the way text threads do when neither person is sure what register the conversation should exist in now. He looked at it once or twice over the following days, the way you look at a door that might or might not open, and then he stopped looking and went back to the fence and the hens and the kale and Sophie's homework and all the ordinary machinery of his life. Sophie asked about Vivian twice in the first week, once at dinner, once at bedtime. Both times he told her the same thing, that Vivian was busy, that she lived far away, that they'd hear from her when they heard from her. Sophie received these answers with the expression of someone filing a dispute that she intended to revisit at a better moment and let it go. The farm work intensified as October deepened. The first frost came on the 14th, just early enough to catch him off guard, and he spent 2 days dealing with the garden, pulling what could be saved, composting what couldn't, turning the soil in the beds that would lie empty until spring. The maples went orange and then red and then started dropping in earnest, and the fields had that particular October quality of light that always struck him as beautiful in a way that was slightly melancholy. Too much gold in the air for it to be entirely comfortable. He didn't think about Vivian constantly. He thought about her the way you think about something that's changed the shape of a room, not always consciously, but it's there in the peripheral vision, a different geometry than before. On the 22nd of October, 19 days after the courthouse, his phone rang at 8 in the evening while he was helping Sophie with a math worksheet that required adding fractions, which she found personally offensive. He looked at the screen and felt something rearrange itself in his chest. He answered. Hey. Hey. Vivian's voice. The real one, not the boardroom version. Slightly rough at the edges, like she was tired or had been talking all day, or both. Is this a bad time? I'm doing fractions with Sophie. Give me 1 second. He looked at his daughter, who had registered the name with a perceptible brightening of attention. Finish the next 2 problems. I'll be right back. He went to the kitchen. How are you? He asked. Surviving, she said. The single word carried about 6 weeks of information in it. The company is... She exhaled. It's a lot. Martin's still working through the legal aftermath. There's an internal investigation into how Damien got access to the codicil information, which is... She stopped. I'm not calling to talk about work. I told myself I wasn't going to call and immediately make it about work. What were you going to make it about? A pause. I don't know. I wanted to hear your voice. She said it plainly, without decoration, in the same way she'd said everything at the kitchen table 3 weeks ago. That sounds strange. It doesn't sound strange, he said. Another pause, shorter. How's Sophie? Outraged by fractions. Otherwise fine. She started a new drawing series. Now it's horses and a dog. The campaign is expanding. He heard her laugh, and the tightness in his chest eased in a way he hadn't known was there until it eased. They talked for 40 minutes. Not about the company, not about the marriage, not about Damien or attorneys or board meetings. They talked about small things, Sophie's teacher, the frost, a book Vivian had been reading on the train, the fact that Ethan had found a family of raccoons in the barn that he was currently in a cold war with. It was the kind of conversation that didn't go anywhere in particular, that existed for the pleasure of its own motion, 2 people talking because they wanted to talk to each other and had stopped needing a reason. After that, the calls became regular. Not every night. Sometimes every few nights. sometimes once a week when things were intense on her end. He learned the rhythms of her work week. Mondays were always brutal, board meetings or investor calls or both. Thursdays were better, the week's major crises usually resolved or at least contained. Friday evenings, she was often on a train somewhere, and she'd sometimes call from the train with the ambient sound of movement underneath the conversation. He told her things he didn't usually tell people. Not dramatic things. He wasn't dramatic by nature, but specific things. The particular loneliness of November mornings on a farm when the fields are bare and the sky is flat gray and there's a lot of silence and not enough to fill it. The way Sophie sometimes asked questions about Claire that he couldn't answer, and he didn't know yet whether the not knowing was something he needed to fix. The fact that sometimes at night he walked the farm alone in the dark, just to do something with the restless feeling that didn't have a name. She told him things too, about growing up in the Sterling family, which from the inside looked nothing like it did from the outside. About the years after college, moving to New York at 23 with a last name that was both a door and a target. About Edgar. The real Edgar, not the Forbes profile. The one who'd called her every Sunday morning and always asked about her week before he talked about the company and sometimes forgot to talk about the company at all. She told him she'd been in therapy since she was 26, which she mentioned in the offhand way people mention things they've made peace with. She told him she had a recurring nightmare where she showed up to a meeting and couldn't remember anything she was supposed to know. She told him that sometimes she sat in her apartment in New York on Sunday mornings and couldn't think of a single person she could call without it being a transaction of some kind. Until now, she said, on a Thursday in early November. He didn't say anything for a moment. Outside, it was raining again. November rain, colder and less dramatic than the storm that had brought her to his door, just steady and gray. Yeah, he said. Until now. It was 3 weeks after that when she came back. She didn't give him a lot of notice. A text on a Wednesday afternoon. I have a gap in the schedule Friday through Sunday. Is it okay if I come? He looked at the text for about 15 seconds and replied, Yeah, come. She arrived Friday evening in the same silver car, which this time had no mud on it because she'd evidently come from New York in better weather, and she had a proper bag this time instead of just a cracked phone, and she was wearing jeans and a sweater and flat shoes that were actually appropriate for November in Vermont, which he noted as a form of progress. Sophie heard the car in the driveway and was out the front door before Ethan got there, which was not something he'd anticipated and which caused a brief commotion on the porch when Sophie, who was 7 and not yet burdened by any instinct toward restraint, said, I knew you were coming back, as though this had been obvious all along. Your dad told you? Vivian said. No, I just knew. Sophie examined her with the frank top-to-bottom assessment she applied to arrivals. You're wearing normal shoes this time. I learned my lesson. Do you want to see the barn? Dad fixed the fence thing. Sophie, Ethan said. She just got here. Let her get inside. I'd like to see the barn, Vivian said. So they went to the barn first, all 3 of them, in the last thin light of the November evening, and Sophie gave a tour with the proprietary enthusiasm of someone who had been preparing this presentation for weeks. The hens. The 2 goats Ethan had picked up in September from a neighbor downsizing their operation. The patched fence, which Sophie pointed out with the pride of someone who had watched it be repaired and considered herself partly responsible for its success. Vivian asked questions about the goats that were genuine questions, not performed interest, and Sophie answered them with equal seriousness, and Ethan stood slightly apart from them in the barn door and watched and felt something move in his chest that he didn't immediately name. The weekend settled into a shape that surprised him with how easy it was. Vivian slept in the spare bedroom again. The quilt, the uneven floor, the window overlooking the back field. And she helped with breakfast both mornings without being asked, and nobody made a thing of it. She and Sophie started a jigsaw puzzle on Saturday afternoon, 1,000 pieces, horses in a field, and Ethan came in from outside to find them both on the living room floor, surrounded by pieces, with the focused, comfortable silence of people who have worked out between them how to be in the same space. Saturday evening, after Sophie went to bed, he and Vivian sat on the back porch with a bottle of wine he'd opened because it seemed like a night that called for wine. Cold enough for jackets, clear sky, the kind of November night where you can see every star and the stillness is so complete you can hear the creek at the bottom of the property. Can I ask you something? She said. Yeah. What do you actually want from... She stopped, rephrased. I'm trying to figure out what this is, what we are. And I keep running into the problem that I don't know what you want. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the sky. I don't know how to want things the right way anymore, he said. After Claire, I spent a long time just maintaining, keeping Sophie okay, keeping the farm going, keeping myself functional, and wanting things, real things, not just logistics, that felt dangerous. Like if you want something and it goes wrong, you have to survive that, and I wasn't sure I had the bandwidth. Vivian was quiet, listening. But I think, he turned the glass in his hands, I think I want this, whatever this is. I think I want you to come back when you can come back. I think I want the phone calls. I think I want to see what this becomes when we stop treating it like a temporary arrangement. She looked at him, and the starlight was not nothing, and her expression was the one she only had when she'd stopped performing anything. I don't know how to do this, she said. A real version of this. I've been alone for so long that I've forgotten, or maybe I never properly learned, how to be part of something with another person. I don't know how to do it either, he said. Not anymore. That's not exactly reassuring. No, he agreed, but it's honest. She almost smiled. Then she looked up at the sky and they were quiet together, which was its own kind of answer. What came next was neither sudden nor simple. It was the slow, imperfect work of two people figuring out the shape of something new while also maintaining the shapes of everything else. Vivian came back the first weekend of December and the weekend after Christmas. Ethan drove to New York twice in January, once alone, once with Sophie, who received New York City with the same focused, observant gravity she received everything, filing it systematically for future use. Vivian's apartment was the kind of place that looked like a magazine and felt, underneath the surfaces, like nobody really lived there, which she acknowledged without being asked. I've been here 6 years, she said, on the first visit, standing in her own kitchen watching him make coffee because she'd admitted she'd never learned to use the expensive coffee machine properly. I don't have a single thing on the walls that I actually chose. The interior designer chose them. I wrote a check. He looked at the art on the walls. Technically good, certainly expensive, absolutely impersonal. And then at the kitchen, which had every appliance and none of the marks of actual cooking. We can fix that, he said. Fix what? The walls, the kitchen, the fact that it doesn't look like anyone lives here. She looked at him the way she sometimes did when he said something that moved her, and she wasn't sure whether to let that show. You want to redecorate my apartment? I want you to have a home, he said. That's different. She looked at him for a moment more. Yeah, she said quietly. Okay. But the thing about slow and imperfect processes is that they run on their own schedule, and external events do not wait for people to be ready. Damien Cross had not disappeared. Ethan knew this in the abstract. Vivian mentioned it periodically. Martin Gress provided updates. The internal investigation at Sterling Industries had turned up enough to confirm that someone in the legal department had communicated the codicil's contents to Damien before the official review, though the precise chain of communication was still being unraveled. Damien's legal team had filed a challenge to the validity of the marriage. The fraud allegation that had been telegraphed in that phone call Ethan had overheard, which Martin was handling through proper channels. On paper, it was being managed. On paper. The letter arrived in mid-February, addressed to Ethan at the farm. He almost never got personal mail. The box at the end of the drive mostly accumulated seed catalogs and the occasional birthday card from his mother in Ohio. So the envelope with the name of a New York law firm in the upper left corner was already anomalous before he opened it. He stood in the driveway with the February cold cutting through his jacket and read it, and by the time he finished reading it, something cold that had nothing to do with the temperature had settled in his stomach. The letter informed him, in the careful language of legal threat, that Damien Cross's legal team intended to depose him in connection with a civil fraud action challenging the validity of the Sterling marriage. The deposition would require him to answer, under oath, a range of questions regarding the circumstances of his marriage to Vivian Sterling, including but not limited to the nature of their prior relationship, whether any financial inducements were offered or received, whether the marriage was entered into for the primary purpose of satisfying an inheritance condition rather than for legitimate matrimonial reasons, and whether he had received or been promised any compensation in exchange for his participation. At the bottom of the letter, in a paragraph that was almost conversational in its tone, Mr. Cross wishes to note that he bears no personal ill will toward Mr. Calloway and recognizes that he may have been an unwitting participant in arrangements he did not fully understand. Should Mr. Calloway wish to discuss his situation independently of Miss Sterling's legal representation, Mr. Cross's team is available to speak with him directly. Ethan read that paragraph twice. Then he folded the letter, put it back in the envelope, and called Vivian. She picked up on the second ring. "Hey, I got a letter from Damien's lawyers," he said. The quality of the silence on the other end changed immediately. He heard her breathe. "What kind of letter?" He described it. She listened without interrupting. By the time he finished, the silence had a different texture. Not empty, but dense, compressed, the silence of someone processing something fast. "The deposition notice isn't unexpected," she said carefully. "Martin said they might try this." "The part where they suggest I contact them independently of your lawyers," Ethan said. "That's the part I want to talk about." "Yes." A beat. "They're trying to separate us. They think if they isolate you, offer you an off-ramp, imply that you're being manipulated by me, they can get you to say something under deposition that contradicts our account of the marriage." "Our account," he repeated. "Ethan, I need you to be straight with me. Right now. All of it." He was standing in the driveway in the February cold, and his jaw was tight, and he was not angry at her, not exactly. But something was pulling at the edge of his composure, the feeling of a situation with more layers than he'd been shown. "Is there anything about this situation that you haven't told me? About the codicil, about Damien, about why he thinks he can make a fraud case?" The pause lasted 2 seconds, 2.5. "There's something," she said. He closed his eyes briefly. "Tell me." "When I came to you that night, I told you Martin thought the language of the codicil was ambiguous, that Damien's interpretation might not hold up in court." She stopped. "What I didn't tell you was that Martin also said, in his honest legal opinion, that a marriage entered into specifically to satisfy an inheritance condition without the parties having an established romantic relationship could potentially be characterized as not fraudulent exactly, but legally vulnerable. It would depend on how it was presented, which is why Damien is going after it." "Yes." Ethan looked at the bare February field across the road. A crow landed on the fence post at the edge of the property and looked at him with the flat, unemotional assessment crows bring to things. "So when you came to my door," he said slowly, "you already knew there was a chance this could come back around, that I could get pulled into a legal fight." "I knew it was possible. I thought if we got through the morning, if the certificate was filed before the deadline, the immediate crisis would be resolved and any challenge would be manageable on your end. Your lawyers, your legal fight. Yes. And not something you needed to mention to me." Another pause, shorter. "I should have told you," she said. It was flat and honest and didn't try to dress itself up. "I was scared and I was out of time and I prioritized getting through the morning, and I told myself it would probably be nothing, and that was—" She stopped. "That was me protecting myself at the expense of being honest with you, and that's not okay. I know it's not okay." He breathed in the cold air. He could be angry about this. He had standing to be angry about it. She'd come to him in crisis and made a request that he'd agreed to without full information, and that information was now standing in his driveway in the form of a legal threat. He could list the ways this was not okay, and he wouldn't be wrong about any of them. But he kept coming back to the 2 seconds of pause before she said, "There's something." Not the long pause of someone calculating what to admit. 2 seconds. The pause of someone who had decided, apparently, to stop protecting herself and just say the true thing. "Okay," he said. "Okay. I'm not—" He rubbed his hand over his face in the gesture he used when he needed a moment. "I'm not going to pretend this doesn't matter. It does. We're going to have to talk about this properly. But right now I need to know what the actual situation is, legally. What does the deposition mean for me?" The shift back to practical ground was apparently something she could work with. She moved into it with the focused clarity that was one of the things he had come to genuinely rely on in her. The ability, when the situation required it, to simply look at a problem clearly. "Martin needs to talk to you," she said. "Before anything else. You can retain your own attorney. You should have independent representation. And then Martin will brief you both on the situation as it stands." "What is the situation as it stands?" "Damien's fraud case is weak," she said. "That's Martin's assessment, and he's not the type to overstate. The marriage is legally valid. Everything was properly executed. The fact that it was arranged under time pressure doesn't make it fraudulent. People get married quickly for all kinds of reasons that aren't fraud." She paused. "But Damien's strategy isn't to win the fraud case outright. It's to make the process expensive and painful enough that the board of Sterling Industries starts asking whether I'm too distracted and embattled to run the company effectively. It's a pressure campaign. To force you to settle." "Yes." He thought about that. About Damien Cross, who had waited weeks for Vivian to fail, and then hired 3 lawyers and then tried to call her on the morning of the ceremony with that smooth, practiced voice, and now was sending letters to a farm in Vermont designed to create doubt. "What does he want?" Ethan asked. "If it's a pressure campaign, what's the settlement he's pushing toward?" "Controlling interest in 2 subsidiary companies and a seat on the main board." Her voice had flattened in the way it did when something made her contemptuous. "He's been after that board seat for years. Edgar never gave it to him. Edgar knew exactly what he was." "Your grandfather knew Damien was going to do this?" Silence. "I've wondered about that," she said slowly. "I've wondered whether he put the codicil in because he knew Damien would try to use it as an angle, whether the whole thing was designed to draw Damien out." She paused. "I don't know. I can't ask him." Ethan looked at the crow on the fence post. The crow looked back. After a moment of mutual regard, it opened its wings and lifted off, heading across the field in the particular unhurried way of things that have no doubt about where they're going. "I need to come to New York," he said. "Ethan, you don't have to—" "I'm not saying it as a burden. I'm saying I need to sit in a room with you and your attorney and understand exactly what I'm dealing with, because I can't deal with it properly at a distance, and I'm not going to let this whole thing play out around me while I stand in a field in Vermont." He heard the edge in his own voice, not at her, but at the situation, at the specific frustration of being a peripheral figure in a story that had his name in it. "I'm in this. Whether I wanted to be or not, I'm in it. So I'm going to be in it with my eyes open." The silence this time was different, warmer somehow, though that seemed like an odd quality for silence. "Okay," she said. "When can you come?" "I'll arrange something with Mrs. Adler for Sophie. I can be there by Wednesday. I'll have Martin ready. And Vivian." "Yeah." "We need to talk," he said. "Just us. Not lawyers." "I know," she said quietly. "I know we do." He put the phone in his pocket and stood in the driveway for another minute, looking at the bare field, the gray February sky, the fence post where the crow had been. The cold was working its way through his jacket now, and he should go inside, but he stood a moment longer, letting himself feel the full weight of the situation. Not dramatizing it, not catastrophizing it, just looking at it clearly. He had walked into something that was bigger than he'd known it was. But he'd walked into it with his eyes open enough, and he was not the kind of man who walked out of things when they got complicated. He'd learned that about himself in the years after Claire, that the way he was made didn't really allow for retreat. You dealt with what was in front of you. You dealt with it the best way you could. You kept going. He went inside to call Mrs. Adler. The train to New York was 4.5 hours, and Ethan spent most of it looking out the window at the landscape changing from Vermont to Massachusetts to Connecticut, the snow that was still on the ground in the north giving way to bare brown fields, and then to the dense packed suburbs that signaled you were approaching the city. He had his notebook, a physical one, because he'd always thought better on paper, and he made notes about what he knew and what he needed to know and what questions he intended to ask. Vivian met him at Penn Station. He hadn't expected that. He'd assumed she'd send a car or tell him the address of the office where Martin Gress worked, and instead she was standing inside the main concourse in a black coat, scanning the incoming crowd with the particular attention of someone who is trying to look casual and not quite succeeding. She saw him and her shoulders dropped slightly with relief. "You didn't have to come meet me," he said. "I know." She said it the same way he'd said "I know" when she told him he didn't have to clear the leaves from her windshield. Same register. They were apparently building a small shared vocabulary of not having to and choosing to anyway. They took a car to Martin's office, which was in Midtown, the kind of office that had a view and a very quiet receptionist and artwork that Ethan suspected cost more than his barn. Martin Gress met them in a conference room and shook Ethan's hand with the same measured respect he'd shown at the courthouse. And they sat down, and for the next 2 hours Ethan learned more about estate law, codicil litigation, and the specific legal theory of fraudulent marriage than he'd ever had any reason to know. Martin was thorough and unhurried and didn't talk down to him. Ethan asked questions when he had them and took notes in his notebook, and at one point pushed back on Martin's characterization of the deposition risk, which caused Martin to revise his phrasing in a way that Ethan found more useful. When they were done, Martin had 2 calls and left them alone in the conference room. Vivian was looking at the table. Ethan was looking at her. "Say it," she said. "I'm not angry," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not angry. But I need this to work differently going forward. I need to know things when you know them, not the edited version, the actual version. Even if you think I'll react badly, even if you're scared of how I'll react." She looked up at him. "You're used to managing things alone," he said. "I understand that. I do the same thing. It's a habit you build when you're the only one responsible for everything. But we can't—" He stopped, started again. "If this is going to be real, we can't operate on partial information. That's not a partnership. That's just 2 people in proximity, each handling their own version of the situation." Vivian was quiet for a moment. She was looking at him with an expression that was open and slightly uncomfortable, the look of someone having a mirror held up in a way they hadn't anticipated. "You're right," she said. Yes, you're right. I know I am." The corner of her mouth moved. "You said that very calmly." "I'm a calm person. Don't mistake it for not meaning it." "I don't," she said. "I really don't." A pause settled between them. Outside the conference room window, 30 floors below, the city was doing what it always did, indifferent and relentless and absolutely full of itself. And in here, it was just the 2 of them at a conference table with a legal notepad between them and something that needed to be said. "I'm scared," Vivian said. It came out quietly, without setup. "Of Damien?" he asked. "Of this." She gestured vaguely between them. "Of what happens if I let this be real and it—" She pressed her lips together. "I've spent a long time being careful, not letting things be real because real things can be taken away. And I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like I need 10 years of therapy. You've had 6, he said. She laughed, startled, then covered her face briefly with both hands. "I walked into that." "Yeah." She put her hands down and looked at him with the fully open, undefended expression that she only had when she'd decided to stop protecting herself. It was still new enough to be startling when it appeared. "I don't want to be careful anymore," she said. "With you. I'm tired of being careful." Something shifted in the room. Ethan reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not a dramatic gesture, just placed his hand on top of hers, the way you do when you want someone to know you're there without making a speech about it. She looked at their hands. "Okay," he said. She turned her hand over underneath his, palm up. "Okay," she said. They sat like that for a moment in the quiet conference room, the city moving below them, 30 floors down and a world away. Then Martin knocked and came back in with a revised timeline and more things that needed to be discussed, and they pulled their hands back and straightened in their chairs and attended to the work in front of them, the way adults do, dealing with the immediate and the practical, because the bigger things tend to take care of themselves if you stay in the room long enough. The deposition was scheduled for the 3rd week of March. In the intervening weeks, Ethan consulted with his own attorney, a practical woman in Burlington named Karen Walsh, who had handled his farm's legal incorporation years ago, and who, upon being briefed on the situation, had the restraint to say that's quite a story exactly once, and then got directly to work. He was deposed on a Wednesday afternoon in a conference room not unlike Martin's, with Karen on his left and Damian Cross's lead attorney across the table and a stenographer in the corner. He was in that room for 3 hours and 40 minutes. He answered every question he was asked. He was precise and consistent, and he didn't volunteer information, but he didn't obscure it. When asked about the circumstances of the marriage, he described them accurately. The storm, Vivian at the door, the conversation through the night, the decision at sunrise. When asked whether he had received financial compensation, he said no. When asked whether he had known Vivian Sterling prior to the marriage, he said yes, 12 years, and described the nature of their friendship accurately. When Damian's attorney, a thin man with an expensive suit and the manner of someone who had calculated the exact odds and liked them, asked, "Would you characterize your marriage to Ms. Sterling as a genuine marriage?" Ethan looked at him steadily and said, "I would, despite the circumstances under which it was entered into." "People get married under all kinds of circumstances," Ethan said. "The circumstances of how something starts don't determine what it becomes." The attorney wrote something on his notepad. Ethan couldn't tell whether it was good or bad, and didn't particularly care. He'd said the true thing. He got on the train back to Vermont that evening, and Vivian called him before the train had left the station. "Martin said it went well," she said. "It went fine." He leaned his head back against the seat. He was tired in the specific way that comes from sustained, careful attention. He asked good questions. I answered them. "Are you okay?" He thought about the question. The train was moving now, through the tunnels under the city, the dark, and then light, and then dark of the underground sections, and he could see his own reflection in the window, tired, a little rough around the edges, real. "Yeah," he said. "I'm okay." "Ethan, I know. I haven't said anything yet." "I know. Say it anyway." A pause. "Thank you," she said. The same way she'd said it on the porch that first morning, like it cost something, like it meant more than the words themselves could carry. For being in it. For not, her voice caught slightly, for not leaving when it got complicated. He looked at his reflection in the window, at the dark tunnel walls going past outside. "I told you," he said, "I'm not built for leaving." The train came out of the tunnel into the gray afternoon light of the Bronx, and he watched the city give way to suburbs, give way to the first glimpse of the river. And somewhere in New York, Vivian was sitting with whatever she was feeling, and it didn't need to be resolved tonight, or named tonight, or fitted into a shape that made sense. They stayed on the phone for another hour without saying anything particularly important, which was, he had come to understand, the most important kind of conversation. Outside the train window, the Hudson River appeared alongside the track, wide and gray and very old, moving south toward the city he'd just left, carrying whatever it always carried, debris and history, and the cold March light reflecting off the surface in pieces, broken and bright and moving. The hearing was set for April 9th. Martin Gress delivered the news on a Tuesday morning in late March, in the measured tone he used for things that were significant but not catastrophic. The tone that said, "This is serious, and I need you to treat it seriously, but I also need you to remain functional." The fraud challenge had been formalized. Damian's legal team had filed with the Whitmore County Superior Court, arguing that the Sterling marriage was entered into under conditions that rendered it legally void. Specifically, that it was a contractual arrangement disguised as a marriage, designed to circumvent the inheritance condition rather than to establish a genuine matrimonial relationship. The hearing would determine whether the case had sufficient merit to proceed to full trial. Vivian called Ethan that evening from what sounded like the back of a car. He could hear city sounds underneath her voice, horns, the particular acoustic texture of New York in transit. "April 9th, he said, when she'd given him the date. "Yes. That's 5 weeks." "I know." He was in the kitchen, standing at the counter with a glass of water he hadn't drunk yet, looking out the window at the dark backfield. Sophie was asleep. The house was quiet in the way it got after 8 p.m., a particular settled quiet that he'd learned in the years since Claire to find comfortable rather than heavy. "Tell me what the hearing means practically," he said. "Best case, worst case." Best case, the judge throws out Damien's challenge at the hearing, finds it without sufficient merit, dismisses it. Martin thinks that's the most likely outcome. The legal basis is genuinely thin. She paused. Worst case, the judge allows it to proceed to trial. That means months. That means discovery, more depositions, the whole case laid out publicly. Publicly? Sterling Industries is a public company. A legal challenge to the validity of my marriage it's already generating attention in the financial press. A full trial would be, she stopped. It would be bad. Not fatal, but bad. He was quiet for a moment. "What does Damien actually have?" he said, evidence-wise. "What can he actually put in front of a judge?" "The timeline," she said it flatly. "The marriage happening 11 hours after I showed up at your door. The fact that we hadn't been in contact in 6 years. The codicil deadline." A pause. "And there's a witness. Someone who saw us at the Whitmore Town Clerk's office that night. Andrea, the clerk who processed the application. Damien's team deposed her last week." "I know Andrea." "She told the truth," Vivian said quickly. "She didn't say anything that wasn't accurate. But accurate is the accurate version of that night, stated without context, sounds exactly like what Damien says it was." Ethan thought about that. He thought about sitting at Andrea's counter at 10 p.m. in the middle of a thunderstorm, Vivian in his oversized jacket, both of them handing over IDs and explaining why they needed an emergency waiver. Accurate, yes. Contextualized, it was one thing. Stripped of context, presented to a skeptical judge by a competent attorney, he could see how it looked. "There's something else," Vivian said. He waited. Damien's team submitted a financial disclosure request, looking for any evidence that money changed hands between us in connection with the marriage. She was choosing her words carefully, which was itself a signal. "Martin says they're going to find the account." "What account?" A pause that was half a second too long. "I set up a discretionary fund in your name after the marriage." "Ethan, I was going to tell you." "What fund?" His voice was even, deliberately even. $50,000. I set it up the week after the courthouse. I intended it as not a payment. It was never meant as a payment. It was meant to be there in case you needed it, in case any of this caused problems for you financially, in case... She stopped. "I should have told you. I know. I should have told you." The water glass was cold in his hand. "Vivian," he said, "I know. You set up an account in my name without telling me." "Yes." "For $50,000. "Yes." He put the glass down on the counter because he needed his hand free. He pressed it flat against the countertop and breathed through his nose, the way he did when he needed to let the first wave of a response pass before he opened his mouth. She knew him well enough by now to wait. "Has the fund been accessed?" he asked. "No. I never gave you the information. I set it up and then I kept not mentioning it because..." She stopped herself. "Because every time I thought about telling you, I knew how it would land, and I kept convincing myself I'd find a better moment." "There was no better moment because it was wrong," he said, not raising his voice, not giving the words more weight than they needed. "You know it was wrong." "Yes," she said quietly. "I do. It looks like exactly what Damien is saying it is. It looks like payment." "I know." A pause. "Martin says we disclose it proactively. Submit it to the court ourselves before Damien's team surfaces it. Control the narrative, explain what it was intended to be, demonstrate that it was never accessed, provide the full context. Which requires me to explain something I didn't know existed. Ethan, I'm not saying I'm done with this conversation," he said. "I'm saying I need 20 minutes. I'll call you back." He ended the call before she could respond, set the phone on the counter, and stood in his kitchen in the dark. The thing was, and he knew this, he was aware of it even as the frustration sat in his chest like a stone. The thing was that he understood why she'd done it. He understood the logic of it, which was the logic of someone who had spent her entire life operating in a world where everything had a price and the only protection against being taken advantage of was to be the one managing the transaction. She'd wanted to protect him. She'd done it in the way that felt natural to her, which was financial and unilateral, and she had known it was wrong and done it anyway, and then not told him. And that was the part that was actually the problem. Not the money, the not telling him. He thought about the conference room conversation in February. I need this to work differently going forward. I need to know things when you know them. She'd agreed. She'd said you're right, and she'd meant it. He believed she'd meant it, and then 3 weeks later she was describing a financial account she'd established in his name the week after their marriage. This was the real work of it. This was the thing that was not in any script. Not the crisis, not the courtroom, not Damien and his lawyers. This. Two people with entrenched patterns of operating alone, trying to build something together, and failing in exactly the ways their individual histories had made inevitable. He went to the back porch. It was cold. Late March in Vermont was still cold, the nights dropping below freezing, the days uncertain. He stood without a jacket for a few minutes, not as punishment, just because the cold clarified things, gave the body something concrete to respond to while the mind worked. Then he went back inside and called her. She picked up immediately. Here's what I need you to understand, he said. The money doesn't matter. Whether it's $50,000 or $5,000 or $5, the number is not the issue. The issue is that you made a decision that directly affects me and involves my name and my legal situation, and you didn't tell me. Again, he let that sit for a second. I understand why you do this. I understand that operating alone is so deeply built into the way you function that you probably didn't even register it as keeping something from me. You registered it as managing a situation. But from where I'm standing, it is the same thing twice. And if it happens a third time, Vivian, we have a real problem. Silence on the other end, the kind that had weight. I hear you, she said. I need you to do more than hear me. I know. Her voice was different, quieter, stripped down. I'm working on it. I'm actually working on it. That's not an excuse, it's just... She stopped. I'm aware that the way I operate is that it creates distance, that it keeps people out. I've been aware of it for years. Being aware of it and actually changing it are two very different things. I know that too, he said. I'm not asking for perfect. I'm asking for honest. I know. So be honest with me right now. Is there anything else? Anything else attached to this situation that has my name on it, or that affects me, that I don't know about? A pause. He was aware that he was essentially asking her to do the thing she found hardest. Full disclosure. No managed version, no edited package of information. And he held the silence and waited. No, she said. That's everything. He believed her. Not blindly, because he'd believed her in February and she'd still held this back, but because of the specific quality of the silence before the word, the particular hesitation of someone checking thoroughly rather than deflecting. Okay, he said. Okay? We talk to Martin tomorrow, together, and we go into April 9th together, and whatever comes out of that hearing, we deal with it together. A pause. That's what together means, Vivian. It means I don't get the curated version. A long silence. Then, I'm scared of losing you. Very quiet. Plain as anything. I know that's not the right thing to say right now, but it's the true thing. He sat with that for a moment. You're not going to lose me by being honest with me, he said. That's actually the one guaranteed way to keep me. She didn't say anything for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had the slightly roughened quality of someone holding something tightly in check. I'll be there, she said, for the hearing. In person. I know you will. The 5 weeks between that conversation and the hearing had the quality of time that knows it's running towards something. Not slow, not fast, but dense, each day carrying more weight than normal. Ethan prepared with Karen Walsh in Burlington, going through the likely questions, the documents, the timeline. Vivian and Martin handled the proactive disclosure of the account, submitting it to the court with a full explanation before Damien's team could surface it as a surprise. Martin told them, with his characteristic measured precision, that the preemptive disclosure was the right move. It demonstrated good faith and removed the account as a weapon. Damien's response, delivered through his lead attorney in a filing 3 days before the hearing, was to add a paragraph arguing that the account's existence demonstrated premeditated financial arrangement, and that its proactive disclosure was itself evidence of a coordinated legal strategy rather than genuine transparency. When Ethan read that filing, he felt something crystallize in him that he hadn't felt before. Not anger, exactly. Something colder and more focused. The feeling of understanding, clearly and completely, the nature of what he was dealing with. Damien Cross was not interested in the truth. Damien Cross was interested in winning, and he was willing to reinterpret any fact in any direction to serve that end. The truth presented as transparency got reinterpreted as strategy. The truth presented as complexity would get reinterpreted as evasion. There was no version of the truth that Damien's team couldn't pick up and throw like a rock. He told Vivian this on the phone 4 days before the hearing. "I know," she said. "Martin's been saying the same thing. The goal isn't to convince Damien's team, it's to convince the judge." "What's the judge like?" "Her name is Margaret Caldwell. Martin's appeared before her twice. He says she's very sharp, doesn't like theatrical lawyering, doesn't like being played. He says if the case is as thin as he believes it is, she'll see it. And if it's not as thin as he believes, then we deal with that." He arrived in New York the day before the hearing. Sophie had been told something vague and accurate, that there was a legal thing related to the marriage that Ethan needed to attend, and had accepted this with the pragmatic equanimity she brought to things she understood were adult matters. Mrs. Adler would stay with her. Sophie had extracted a promise that Ethan would be home by dinner the following evening, which he had given with more confidence than he entirely felt. Vivian met him at the apartment this time, not the station. She buzzed him up and met him at the elevator, and when he came off it, she looked at him for a moment in the hallway and then stepped forward and put her arms around him, which was not something they had done before. Not like this. Not with this directness, her face against his shoulder and her hands gripping the back of his jacket, like she was anchoring herself to something. He put his arms around her. He didn't say anything. Sometimes the right response to a person is just your presence, and he was learning with her to trust that. After a moment, she stepped back. She didn't apologize for it, and he didn't make a thing of it. "Are you hungry?" she said. "Starving. The train food was—" "No. I ordered from the Thai place on 53rd. It should be here in 20 minutes. You know how to order Thai food, but you can't use your own coffee machine. The Thai place has a phone number," she said. "The coffee machine requires reading German. The instructions are in 5 languages. None of them are ones I speak." They ate dinner at her kitchen island, which she had, since January, made minor efforts to humanize, a cutting board that showed use, a plant that was not dead, a small print on the wall above the toaster that she'd bought at a street market in Chelsea, and that was the only thing in the apartment she could say she'd actually chosen herself. He noticed the print and didn't comment, but she saw him notice it. "It's a start," she said. "It's a good one." They went through the logistics of the morning, what time they needed to leave, what Martin had instructed them regarding comportment in the courtroom, the fact that Damien's team had requested to examine additional documents that Martin had reviewed and cleared. Ethan had his notes from the preparation sessions with Karen Walsh, which were in his jacket pocket, and he looked at them once more after dinner and then put them away because he knew what they said, and looking at them again wasn't going to change anything. At some point, the conversation shifted, the way it always did between them when the logistics were done, into something else. She told him about a board meeting that week in which one of the directors, a man who had been on the Sterling board since before Vivian was born, had said something in her defense that had surprised her with its directness. "He said that Edgar always knew I was the right person," she said. "Not because of the name, because of how I think." She paused. "I've been working alongside this man for 8 years. He's never once said anything like that directly to me. Why now? I think—" She turned her wine glass slowly. "I think watching me go through this, the codicil, Damien, the legal fight, I think it changed how he sees me. Before, I was competent and professional, and I had the last name, and he respected me. Now he's seen me in a crisis, and he knows what I'm made of." Ethan looked at her. "What are you made of?" She looked back. "I don't know yet. I'm finding out." "I think you know more than you think you do." She was quiet, then, What do you see? When you look at me. She said it straightforwardly, not fishing, just asking. He considered it honestly because she deserved an honest answer. Someone who built walls so high she forgot there was a door, he said, and is now trying to figure out where she put it. A pause. Someone who is more afraid of being ordinary than of being alone. Someone who makes scrambled eggs without being asked and holds a 7-year-old's hand in a courthouse and doesn't realize she's doing it. He looked at her steadily. Someone who is better than the version of herself she's been presenting to the world for 30 years. She didn't say anything for a while. She was looking at the table, and he could see the way the words landed. Not comfortably, the way flattery lands, but with the slight disruption of something true hitting something real. That's a lot to live up to, she said finally. You're already living up to it. That's what I'm saying. She looked up at him, and the expression on her face was the open, undefended one. The one that was not Vivian Sterling, the executive, but Vivian, the person, the one he'd been talking to on the phone at 11 p.m. for 5 months. I need to sleep, she said. If I don't sleep tonight, I'm going to be useless tomorrow. Go, he said. I'll clean up. You don't have Vivian. She stopped. She looked at him. Something passed between them that was not quite the same as anything that had passed between them before. Something that had been building in small increments since November, since the porch conversation and the wine and the stars, and was now very close to the surface. Thank you, she said. For the third time, in the way that meant more than the words each time. Get some sleep, he said. She went. He cleaned up the dinner things, moving quietly in her kitchen, and stood at the window for a while looking at the city lights. The enormous, indifferent glittering of New York at night, which he found both overwhelming and oddly beautiful in the way that things you're not from always have a quality that familiarity erases. He thought about the morning. He thought about what it meant to walk into a courtroom and have the truth of his own marriage examined by strangers. He thought about Vivian in the spare room down the hall, her own spare room, in her own apartment that still didn't quite feel like home, and the particular vulnerability of someone who is very capable and very afraid at the same time. He was afraid too. That seemed worth acknowledging, at least to himself, in the private dark of someone else's kitchen. Not of the hearing, exactly. He'd said the true things in the deposition, and he'd say the true things tomorrow, and the truth was the same regardless of what Damien's team threw at it, afraid of something larger, of what it meant to be this far in. Of how much it would cost, specifically, to lose this. Not the legal case, but this. The thing between him and Vivian that didn't have a clean name yet, but was undeniably present and undeniably real. He hadn't let himself love something this much since Claire. He hadn't meant to. You never mean to. It just happens in the accumulation of small things. Phone calls and scrambled eggs, and a woman holding his daughter's hand and sitting on a porch under Vermont stars saying, I don't want to be careful anymore. And then one day you're standing in someone's kitchen in New York at midnight, and you understand that the risk of this is real, and you've already decided to take it. He went to the guest room and lay on top of the covers in the dark, and looked at the ceiling, and outside the city did what it did all night. And somewhere down the hall, Vivian was either asleep or lying in her own dark looking at her own ceiling, and in the morning they would walk into a courtroom together and be examined, and he was, he realized, not sorry about any of it. The Whitmore County Superior Court was different from the room in the courthouse where they'd been married. It was a proper courtroom. Wood paneling, elevated bench, the flag, the seal, the particular gravity of a space designed to communicate that what happened here had consequences. It was 3/4 full. Ethan had not anticipated the number of people. He'd expected the principals and the attorneys, and perhaps a few observers, but the gallery had reporters in it, financial press, 2 he recognized from publications that covered corporate legal matters, and several faces he didn't recognize who had the look of people with something at stake in the outcome. Damien Cross was already at the opposing table when they arrived. Ethan looked at him directly for the first time. In the phone call he'd been a voice, smooth, practiced, contained. In person, he was a compact man in his late 30s, good suit, the kind of face that was attractive enough to be dismissed and calculating enough to be underestimated. He glanced at Ethan when they came in with the brief, assessing look of someone who has built a theory about you and is checking it against the evidence. Ethan looked at him for exactly as long as felt natural, and then looked away. Vivian sat beside him at the table with Martin on her other side and Karen Walsh beside Ethan. She was in a dark blazer, her hair back, the full boardroom version of herself, composed, contained, professional. Her hand on the table was steady. He knew, because he knew her now, that this was the performance she put on when she was afraid, and that underneath it she was working hard to hold the presentation together. He put his hand over hers on the table, briefly. She turned her palm up the same way she had in the conference room in February. Then they both straightened up and looked forward, and Judge Caldwell entered the courtroom. Margaret Caldwell was a small woman in her mid-50s with the particular demeanor of someone who has heard every possible variety of human argument and maintains her own counsel entirely. She settled into her seat, arranged her papers, and looked at both tables with the flat, professional attention of someone who was going to give this exactly what it deserved, and not one thing more. Damien's attorney went first as the filing party. His name was Greaves, the thin man from the deposition. Good suit, measured delivery. He laid out Damien's case methodically. The timeline, the prior estrangement, the emergency circumstances, the financial account. He was good at it. Ethan could acknowledge that objectively. He made the accurate version of events sound like a scheme without ever saying it directly, which was the skill of a certain kind of legal argument, and he did it well. Martin's response was equally measured and considerably warmer. Not emotionally warm, but contextually rich, filling in every blank that Greaves had deliberately left empty. The 12-year friendship, the nature of the codicil, the marriage license process, the deposition testimony, the proactive disclosure of the account. The months of documented contact since the marriage, phone records, travel records, verified visits. Then Greaves called a witness. The witness was not Andrea from the town clerk's office. It was a man named Philip Hartley, who had worked in Sterling Industries' legal department and whose name Ethan recognized from Vivian's descriptions of the internal investigation, the person they'd been trying to identify as the source of the codicil leak. Ethan watched Vivian go very still. Hartley was nervous. He was a man in his early 40s who had clearly not slept well recently, and he had the specific look of someone who has agreed to do something and is now, in the moment of doing it, less certain than he'd been when he agreed. He sat in the witness box and answered Greaves's preliminary questions with careful, minimal answers. Then Greaves asked, "In your time at Sterling Industries' legal department, did you ever observe communications between Damien Cross and Vivian Sterling that suggested a personal arrangement of any kind?" Martin was on his feet. Objection. Vague. Sustained. Rephrase. Greaves rephrased. The question more precisely was about whether Hartley had ever seen documentation relating to the codicil prior to the formal estate review. Hartley said yes. The courtroom shifted. Hartley described, in the careful, limited way of someone who had been coached on exactly how much to say, having seen a copy of the codicil in a file that crossed his desk in the weeks before Edgar Sterling's death, forwarded to him by an internal address he didn't immediately recognize. He had not realized, at the time, what the document was. Greaves then asked, "And what did you do with that document?" Hartley hesitated. The hesitation lasted about 2 seconds, which in a courtroom is a long time. "I forwarded it," he said, "to an external contact." "And who was that external contact?" Another hesitation. Hartley looked at his hands, then at Greaves, then briefly at Damien Cross, a look that was complicated and unhappy and told Ethan more than the words about the exact nature of whatever arrangement Hartley had entered into. "I was told to forward it to Damien Cross's personal attorney," Hartley said. The courtroom was not loud, but it changed in quality, the way rooms do when a piece of information lands that rearranges the structure of what everyone thought they were watching. Greaves moved smoothly on. He'd expected this answer, it was part of his framing, but Martin was already writing on his notepad, fast, and beside Ethan, Vivian had exhaled something that was not quite a sound. The framing Greaves attempted was that Damien had been monitoring the codicil situation as a legitimate interested party, given his status as a potential heir. The framing fell somewhat flat because Hartley's testimony had established something more specific, that someone inside Sterling Industries had been actively channeling information to Damien's personal attorney, which was not monitoring, it was conspiracy. When Martin cross-examined Hartley, he asked 2 questions and nothing more. The first was whether Hartley had been offered anything in exchange for his forwarding of the document. Hartley, after a long pause, said he had been offered a consulting retainer by one of Damien's subsidiary companies. The second question was whether he had disclosed this exchange to the Sterling Industries legal department during the internal investigation. Hartley said he had not. Martin sat down. Judge Caldwell had been watching all of this with the flat professional attention she'd maintained throughout. She looked at Hartley and asked in a tone that was entirely conversational, "Mr. Hartley, are you aware that what you've just described constitutes potential grounds for both a civil breach of fiduciary duty claim and a referral to the state bar?" Hartley looked at her. He looked like a man realizing, with the specific horror of the moment, that the room he'd thought he understood was considerably larger than he'd known. He started. "That's not a question that requires an answer today," Judge Caldwell said mildly and nodded to the clerk. The hearing continued for another 2 hours. Ethan testified briefly. Martin had arranged for him to make a short statement that supplemented his deposition record, and he stood in the witness box and answered the questions put to him with the same steadiness he'd brought to the deposition. When Greaves cross-examined him and asked again about the financial account, Ethan said, "I didn't know about it until last month. When Vivian told me about it, I told her it was wrong of her to set it up without informing me. She agreed. We disclosed it proactively. The account has never been accessed. If that's your evidence of a financial arrangement, I'd like to point out that money that has never moved in any direction is not payment for anything." Greaves asked one more question, which was whether Ethan would characterize his current relationship with Vivian Sterling as a genuine marriage. Ethan said yes. Greaves asked him to elaborate. Ethan looked at him and said, "A genuine marriage is 2 people choosing each other and choosing to keep choosing each other even when it's difficult. That's what we're doing. I'm not sure what other definition you're working from." When they broke for lunch, Vivian and Ethan stood in the hallway outside the courtroom while Martin took a call. She stood close enough to him that their arms were touching, and she was looking at the middle distance with the expression of someone processing a great deal at once. "Hartley," she said quietly. "Yeah." "We knew someone leaked it. We didn't know it was him." She shook her head slightly. "He's been in that department for 7 years. Did you like him?" "I barely knew him." She paused. "That might be the problem. I run a company of 4,000 people, and I barely know the people in my own legal department." She said it without self-pity, as an honest assessment. "I know the directors. I know the heads of departments. And then there's everyone below that who I walk past in the hallway and probably don't see." "You can't know 4,000 people," he said. "No, but maybe I should know the 80 people who have access to my grandfather's estate documents." She was quiet. Edgar knew everyone's name. Every person who worked directly with him. He knew their kids' names, their spouses' names. She looked at her hands. "I always thought that it was his personality, that he was just built that way. I didn't think it was a skill." Ethan looked at her profile, at the honesty in it, the way she was using this moment in the middle of a courtroom hearing to actually learn something rather than just get through it. "You can build it," he said. She looked at him. "Can you learn to be more like Edgar?" "I don't know. I've never tried." He almost said something else. He stopped himself because the hallway of a courthouse at lunchtime was not the right place, and because Martin was coming back down the hall with his phone in hand and the compressed expression that meant information. "The judge is moving faster than expected," Martin said, stopping in front of them. "She's indicated she may issue a ruling from the bench today rather than taking it under advisement, which means—" "She's already decided," Vivian said. "It means she has a strong preliminary view," Martin said carefully. "I've seen her move this quickly before. It's usually because the case is either much stronger or much weaker than anticipated." He looked at Vivian. "Given Hartley's testimony and Greaves's decision to call him, which I believe he will regret, I think we're in a good position." "Define good," Ethan said. The judge now has testimony from Damien's own witness that establishes a premeditated effort to access the codicil information by improper means. That fundamentally changes the character of what Damien is portraying as a legitimate legal challenge. It begins to look like what it is. Martin adjusted his jacket, which is a scheme. The afternoon session was shorter. Judge Caldwell allowed both sides brief closing arguments and then sat for what felt like a very long time, probably 7 minutes, though it was one of those 7-minute periods that had the density of much longer. She looked at her papers. She looked at both tables. Then she spoke. The ruling from the bench was 40 minutes long, which for a preliminary hearing was substantial. Judge Caldwell walked through the case methodically, without theatrical delivery, in the measured tone of someone who had considered everything carefully and arrived somewhere solid. She addressed the timeline argument, the financial account, the nature of the marriage, the deposition records. She addressed Hartley's testimony at length, noting that the circumstances under which Damien Cross had obtained knowledge of the codicil's contents raised significant questions about the good faith basis of his challenge. She was not a dramatic person, and her ruling was not dramatic. It was clear. The fraud challenge was dismissed. She went further than dismissal. She noted that given the evidence of improper information access, she was referring the matter to the relevant bar associations for review of both Damien's conduct and Hartley's. She noted that Sterling Industries' legal department might wish to conduct a thorough independent review of document security protocols. She noted, in a sentence that was the closest she came to editorial, that a legal challenge predicated on manufactured emergency, the codicil leak creating the very conditions that the challenger then attempted to weaponize, was not a use of court resources she was inclined to facilitate. Then she stood up and left the bench, and the courtroom was for a moment entirely still. Ethan became aware that he was holding Vivian's hand. He wasn't certain when that had happened. Somewhere in the 40 minutes of the ruling, their hands had found each other on the table, the way things find each other when the body acts before the mind gives permission. Vivian's hand in his was tight and then loosened, and she breathed out. A single long breath, the kind that carries everything that's been held together for months. Martin was already talking, to Karen Walsh, to his assistant, his voice low and rapid, the machinery of legal follow-up beginning to move. Around them, the gallery was producing the low, sustained sound of people absorbing news. Greaves and his co-counsel were conferring with tight, controlled expressions. Damien Cross was sitting at his table with the stillness of someone who has not yet processed what just happened, or who has processed it and is deciding what expression to show. Ethan looked at him. Just for a moment. He looked at Damien Cross across the courtroom, and Damien looked back. And what Ethan saw was not malevolence exactly. What he saw was the specific expression of someone who had built a plan over months and watched it come apart in an afternoon, and who was smart enough to understand it was largely his own doing. He looked away. He looked at Vivian. She was looking at him, and the expression on her face, the full, open, undefended expression that was just her face without anything on top of it, was one he understood he was probably one of very few people who had ever seen, and he understood that he wanted to keep seeing it for as long as she was willing to show it to him. "Okay?" he said. She pressed her lips together. Her eyes were bright. She was not going to cry, not here, not in this room, but it was close. "Yeah," she said. Her voice was not quite steady. "Yeah, we're okay." Martin reappeared at Vivian's shoulder with a quiet word about the follow-up calls that needed to happen, and the moment was over in the way moments always are, absorbed back into the ongoing movement of things. Vivian shifted into her professional register, not because the moment hadn't mattered, but because things needed to be handled, and she was, at her core, someone who handled things. Ethan sat back in his chair and looked up at the ceiling of the Whitmore County Superior Court. The old pressed tin ceiling, painted over many times, the kind of institutional surface that had absorbed generations of argument and decision and consequence. And he felt, underneath the relief, something else. Something that had been building since October, since a rainy Thursday evening and a woman at his door and the decision made in the small hours of a sleepless night. He felt for the first time in a long time that something in his life had moved in the right direction. Not perfectly, not without cost, but solidly, with the kind of movement that tends to hold. Outside the courthouse, in the thin April afternoon, the maple trees on the town square were just beginning to bud, the very first green, tentative and small against the gray branches. He stood on the courthouse steps and looked at them and thought about the farm, about the field that would need turning next week, about Sophie waiting at home with Mrs. Adler and a horse drawing she'd been working on for 3 days, and a list of questions she'd saved up. He thought about the conversation he still needed to have with Vivian, the real one, the one they kept approaching and circling, that was not about logistics or legal situations or what they were going to do, but about what they already were, what had already become true between them, quietly, in the accumulation of months. That conversation was coming. He could feel it the way he felt weather, in the pressure, in the quality of the air, in something that his body registered before his mind had the language for it. But that was for later. Tonight, they would call Sophie from the car on the drive back to the city, and Sophie would have questions, and Vivian would answer them directly the way she always did, and somewhere in that ordinary exchange something would be confirmed again, quietly, the way real things confirm themselves. The important ones never announce themselves. They just keep being true. They called Sophie from the car. Vivian dialed because Ethan was driving and because she asked if she could, which was the kind of small thing that wasn't small, asking, instead of waiting to be invited. Sophie picked up on the second ring, which meant she'd been holding the phone. "Did it work?" Sophie said without preamble. "It worked," Vivian said. A sound on the other end that was Sophie processing good news, a kind of exhaled yes that was more breath than word. Then, "Did the bad guy lose?" "Completely." "Good." A pause, and then with the directness that Sophie brought to everything that mattered to her. "Are you coming home with Dad?" Vivian glanced at Ethan. He kept his eyes on the road, but the corner of his mouth moved. "Not tonight," Vivian said. "I have some things to take care of in the city, but soon." "How soon?" "Sophie," Ethan said from the driver's seat. "I'm just asking." "It's okay," Vivian said. "Very soon, I promise." Sophie accepted this with the evaluative silence of someone filing a binding commitment. Then she said, "Mrs. Adler made chicken soup. Do you want me to save you some, Dad?" "Save me some." "Okay. Vivian, can I show you my new drawing when you come? It's a horse, but it also has a dog now. The dog is named Gerald." "I would love to see Gerald," Vivian said. "He's brown. Dad won't let me get a real dog either, but I'm working on it." "She's working on it," Ethan confirmed. They said goodbye, and Ethan ended the call, and the car was quiet for a moment, moving through the early April evening, the last light going orange over the hills. "She's relentless," Vivian said. "She gets it from her mother." He said it naturally, the way he'd learned to say things about Claire, present tense of memory rather than the past tense of loss. "Claire wanted a dog for 3 years before I finally got one. She wore me down by attrition." "What happened to the dog?" "He died about a year after Claire. Old age. His name was Walter." A pause. "Sophie doesn't really remember him. She was too young, but she's seen the pictures." Vivian was quiet for a moment. "Do you think you'll get another one?" "Probably." He glanced at her briefly. "The goats were the gateway. Once you have goats, you've basically admitted that the farm is going to keep acquiring living things. Is that a problem?" "No," he said. "It's just the truth of it." They drove the rest of the way into the city, mostly in the comfortable silence that had become one of the reliable features of their time together, the silence that didn't require filling, that was its own kind of communication. By the time they got to Vivian's building, the city was fully in its evening mode, the streets busy and loud and indifferent in the way New York was always indifferent to individual human situations, which Ethan had come to find almost restful. The city didn't care. It just kept going. There was something honest about that. He parked in the building garage and they went up, and Vivian changed out of the hearing clothes while Ethan made coffee because he'd figured out her coffee machine in January. It was German, yes, but the instructions had a diagram, and diagrams were a language he spoke. She came back to the kitchen in the sweatpants, which had migrated over the months from the Vermont farm into a drawer in her apartment, which he had not commented on and which she had not explained. She sat at the counter and wrapped her hands around the mug and looked at him across the kitchen island. "Tell me what you're thinking," she said. He looked at her. He'd been waiting for this, or not waiting exactly, but aware it was coming, the conversation that the car hadn't been quite right for, and the courthouse hallway hadn't been right for, the one that kept finding its moment and not quite landing. "I'm thinking," he said slowly, "that at some point in the last 6 months, we stopped being two people in an arrangement and became two people in something else. And I'm thinking we should probably say that out loud because I'm tired of knowing it without saying it." She held his gaze. "What is the something else?" "You know what it is." "I want you to say it." He set his coffee down. He looked at her, at the woman who had shown up at his door in a thunderstorm and eaten his fries and made his daughter's scrambled eggs and held her hand in a courthouse and said, "I don't want to be careful anymore on a porch under Vermont stars," who was imperfect in specific and identifiable ways, who was still learning how to stay, who had cried exactly once in front of him and probably wouldn't again for a while, and that was fine. That was just who she was. "I love you," he said. The way he said things that were true, plainly, without architecture around them. That's the something else. The kitchen was very quiet. She looked at him, and the open, undefended expression was there, fully, more completely than he'd ever seen it, the face without any performance on top of it, just her. "I've known for a while," she said. Her voice was not quite even. "That I love you. I've been—" She stopped, started again. "I've been holding it because I was scared that if I said it, something would go wrong. That's the specific kind of irrational I am." "That's not irrational," he said. "That's just what happens when you've had things go wrong before. I'm aware I'm a project." "You're not a project," he said. "You're a person. There's a difference." She pressed her lips together. Her eyes were bright, the same way they'd been in the courtroom after the ruling. Not quite tears, just the specific brightness of feeling too much to contain all of it. "I love you," she said. Plainly. No decoration. "I love that you fixed my coffee machine even though I told you it was impossible. I love that you let Sophie come to the courthouse. I love that you got angry at me the right number of times." A pause. "I love that you didn't leave when it was completely reasonable to leave." He came around the counter. He stood in front of her and put his hand against the side of her face, and she leaned into it slightly, the way people lean into things that feel like rest. "I'm not leaving," he said. "I know," she said. "I know that now." He kissed her. It was not a dramatic kiss. It was the kiss of two people who have been moving toward the same place from a long distance and have finally arrived, unhurried because the urgency is gone, because the question has been answered. Her hands came up and held on to the front of his shirt, and he felt the tension in her. Months of it, maybe years of it, begin to loosen, not all at once, because nothing real happens all at once, but in the way genuine relief happens, slowly and completely. When they stepped back, she had her forehead against his jaw, and they stood like that for a moment, just standing. "This is very inconvenient," she said. "What is?" "Falling in love with a farmer in Vermont." He could feel her almost smiling. "I have a company to run. I have board meetings. I have an apartment that is a 4.5-hour drive from your barn. I'm aware of the geography. We have a logistics problem." "We have several," he agreed. "You want to solve them tonight or let them wait till morning?" She lifted her head and looked at him. "Morning," she said. "Good answer." The logistics, as it turned out, did not wait until morning so much as present themselves gradually over the following weeks in the way that practical reality always does, patiently and insistently and without regard for how inconvenient the timing is. The fundamental problem was simple. Ethan had a farm in Vermont and a 7-year-old in school and a life built into the specific soil of a specific place, and Vivian had a company headquartered in New York and a board of directors and obligations that didn't pause for personal circumstances. Neither of them could simply move. Neither of them wanted to ask the other to. They talked about it on the phone, and then in person in Vermont in late April when Vivian came for a long weekend, and then again in May during a trip to New York that Ethan made alone while Sophie was at a school overnight. They talked around the edges of it, and then directly at it, and they disagreed about some parts of it, which was new, not the disagreeing itself, which was inevitable, but the specific texture of disagreeing with someone you love, which was harder and more important than disagreeing with someone you're simply in an arrangement with. Vivian wanted to be at the farm more. That was true, and she said it directly. She wanted the back porch and the goats and Sophie's running commentary and the particular quality of a place that was genuinely lived in, the warm kitchen and the imperfect floors and the sound of the fields at night. She'd been coming up most weekends since the hearing, and every time she arrived, something in her visibly settled, like a mechanism that had been running too fast, finally dropping to its proper speed. But she also needed to be in New York. That was equally true, and she didn't pretend otherwise. Sterling Industries required her presence in ways that couldn't always be managed remotely, and she was, she told him this honestly without apology, genuinely engaged with it. She loved the work. Not the power of it, or not mainly that, but the problem solving, the navigation of complicated human systems, the building of something that had endurance. She'd been preparing for this responsibility her entire adult life, and she was good at it. "I don't want you to give that up," Ethan said, on the back porch in late April. Sophie was inside. The evening was mild, the first genuinely warm evening of the year, the kind that arrives in Vermont like a long-awaited letter. "I know," she said. "I don't want to give it up either." She looked at him. "But I also don't want to spend my life commuting between two places and being only partially present in both." "Then we need to figure out something that isn't that. Do you have suggestions?" "A few," he said. "None of them are perfect." "Tell me the imperfect ones," he told her. The most honest version he could construct, which was that he couldn't leave Vermont, not right now, not while Sophie was in school and the farm was the life he'd built, and the place that still held Claire in some important way he wasn't ready to move away from. But that didn't mean he couldn't be in New York regularly. It didn't mean the geography had to be a wall. It meant they had to build something that accommodated both things, rather than resolving the tension by eliminating one of them. "Sterling Industries has offices in Boston," Vivian said. She said it as though the thought had been sitting in the back of her mind for a while, waiting for the right moment. 2 hours from here, less in good traffic." "I know. If I restructured some of my board obligations to allow more remote management, which Martin has been telling me I should do anyway, for sustainability reasons, I could be here 4 days a week and in Boston or New York the rest of the time." He looked at her. "You do that?" "I'm already doing it in my head," she said. "I've been doing it in my head since February." He sat with that, with the image of it. Vivian Sterling reorganizing her professional life not as a sacrifice but as a decision, the way she made every decision, with full awareness of what it cost and what it was worth. "The spare bedroom," he said. She looked at him. "It's not going to work long term," he said, "for obvious reasons. If you're going to be here 4 days a week—" "I know." She held his gaze steadily. "I know what you're saying. I'm not rushing anything. Sophie is going to be fine," Vivian said, not dismissively, with a kind of calm certainty that came from knowing, which she did know, from 7 months of watching Sophie navigate the world. "Sophie is going to have opinions about everything, including this, and she's going to tell us all of them, and she's going to be fine." "You sound confident about that." "She told me last weekend that I was basically already part of the family," Vivian said. Her words. She said, and I'm quoting exactly, "Vivian, you're basically part of the family, but you should probably get a drawer." He closed his eyes briefly. She did not. She absolutely did. She also said the drawer should be in the hallway closet because that's where the good blankets are, and she thought I'd want to be near the good blankets. He looked at the field for a moment, at the familiar flat line of the tree line at the far edge, the maples in their first full spring green, the particular Vermont green that was almost aggressive, too saturated to be entirely comfortable, the green of a place that took its season seriously. "She's something," he said. "She really is." Vivian's voice had the specific warmth it always had when she talked about Sophie. Unguarded, genuine, the warmth of someone who had not expected to love a child and did anyway, which was the best kind of love because it arrived without being planned or negotiated or managed. He reached over and took her hand. She laced her fingers through his. "A drawer in the hallway closet," he said, "near the good blankets. That's where we're starting." That's where we're starting, she agreed. The conversation with Sophie happened on a Saturday morning in May, over pancakes that Ethan made and Vivian helped with, in the way she'd started to help with things in the kitchen. Not taking over, not directing, but present and participating, the specific domestic fluency of someone who has decided this space is partly hers and is moving in it accordingly. Sophie had already figured out most of it, because Sophie always figured out most of things before adults thought she had. She sat at the kitchen table with her fork in her hand and looked at both of them with the serious assessment she'd been applying to important situations since she was 4 years old. "So Vivian's going to be here more," she said. "A lot more," Ethan said, "if that's okay with you." Sophie appeared to already know it was okay with her, but was going to take her time arriving at the stated position. She ate a bite of pancake. She looked at Vivian. "Do you like pancakes?" "Very much," Vivian said. "Dad makes them with blueberries, but not the ones from the store. From the ones we froze last summer. They're better." "I know, I can tell." Sophie looked at her plate, then at Ethan, then back at Vivian. "Are you going to be like a family kind of person, or just like a friend kind of person?" The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. Ethan looked at Vivian. Vivian looked at Sophie with the full direct attention she always gave to questions that deserved it. "That depends on what you want," Vivian said. "I'm not going to decide that without you." Sophie chewed another bite. She was working through something. Not reluctance, more like due diligence, the internal process of a 7-year-old who had been thinking about this longer than anyone had realized. "My friend Cassie has a stepmom," Sophie said. "She says it's fine. She says actually sometimes the stepmom is better because she doesn't get tired of Cassie as fast as her regular mom does." "That's a reasonable point," Vivian said carefully. "I'm not saying I want you to be my stepmom," Sophie clarified, with a precision that made it clear she was not closing the door, just noting that no formal positions had been offered or accepted. "I'm just saying I know how it works." "Okay," Vivian said. Sophie looked at her father. "Is this the thing where you guys are going to do something and then tell me later that it's already decided?" "No," Ethan said. "Nothing is decided. We're talking." "Good." Sophie returned to her pancakes. "I want to be in the talking." "You're in the talking," he said. "Good." A pause. "Vivian, can you French braid? My dad cannot French braid. Mrs. Adler tries, but she doesn't do it right, and I have a school picture in 3 weeks. Vivian looked at Ethan. He shrugged, which was an honest communication of the limits of his hair abilities. She looked at Sophie. "I can French braid," she said. Sophie considered this the way she considered things of genuine value. "Okay," she said, with the gravity of someone closing a significant deal. "You can be a family kind of person." It wasn't clean. Nothing about it was clean, and Ethan knew better than to expect it to be. There were mornings when the three of them were in the kitchen and everything was easy and warm and felt genuinely like something that worked. And there were other mornings, fewer but real, when Vivian was short-tempered from a work call that had gone badly, or when Sophie was testing the perimeter of the new arrangement in the way children do, pushing to see where the new edges were, or when Ethan was tired in the specific way that single parenting in combination with farm work, in combination with a new relationship created, a tiredness that had no clean address, and he was quieter than usual, and it took him longer to come back to himself. Those days were not disasters. They were just days. And the fact that they could have those days, imperfect, slightly awkward, nobody performing anything, and come back to the table for dinner and still be in it together, was something Ethan came to understand was more valuable than any number of smooth, easy days. Vivian had a drawer in the hallway closet by June. By July, she had an agreement with Sterling Industries board that formalized a hybrid management structure that Martin had helped her architect, giving her significantly more location flexibility. The Boston office took on an expanded role as a regional hub, which turned out to have business benefits that had nothing to do with Vivian's personal situation and which the board received well. She didn't move in. Not that summer, not all at once. That wasn't how it happened. What happened was more gradual and more real, things accumulating, presence increasing, the spare bedroom becoming less spare and the kitchen becoming more genuinely shared, and Sophie's hair appearing in French braids that Ethan could not have produced, on school mornings when Vivian was there, which was more mornings than not. In August, Philip Hartley's consulting arrangement with Damien's subsidiary company was disclosed in the Sterling Industries internal investigation, and he was quietly dismissed. He did not contest it. The Bar Association review of Damien Cross's conduct and his attorney's conduct was ongoing, and Martin tracked it with the methodical patience of someone who understood that these processes took time and was prepared to wait. Damien himself had largely gone quiet. There had been no further legal action since the April dismissal, and the board of Sterling Industries, following the hearing, had formally revoked his advisory role in 2 subsidiaries where he'd maintained a peripheral involvement. He still existed. He was still out there somewhere, probably recalculating, probably not entirely done, but he was quiet, and quiet was enough for now. One evening in late August, Ethan found Vivian at the kitchen table with her laptop open and a pen in her hand and a legal pad next to the laptop, which was her working posture, the one that meant she was deep in something. Sophie was in bed. The windows were open to the warm night, and outside the farm was making its late summer sounds. Crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, the soft bleat of a goat from the direction of the barn. He looked over her shoulder. The screen showed what appeared to be an organizational chart, boxes and lines and names. "What's this?" he said. "I'm learning my legal department," she said. She didn't look up. All 83 people, name, role, how long they've been there, one fact about them. She tapped the legal pad. "I've got 47 so far." He looked at the names on the pad. Beside each one, a detail. 2 daughters, both under 5, runs marathons, dog allergic to everything. 9 years with the company, almost left twice. "Edgar would approve," he said. She looked up at him then. Her expression was complicated and honest and fond, the way it got when his name came up, Edgar, who she was still grieving in the specific ongoing way of people who lose someone they admired alongside someone they loved. "I think about that," she said. "Whether he'd approve, whether this, all of it, is what he hoped for when he wrote the codicil." "What do you think?" She considered it. "I think he didn't know exactly what he hoped for. I think he just knew something had to change, that I had to let someone in. However that happened." She looked at the organizational chart on her screen and then out the window at the dark summer night. "I used to think the codicil was the strangest thing he ever did. This whole elaborate I thought it was manipulative, an old man trying to control something from beyond the grave. And now? Now I think he knew something I didn't." She turned and looked at Ethan. "He knew that I would never have done this on my own. Whatever this is, I never would have knocked on your door. I never would have let myself need someone badly enough to admit it." She paused. "He built a door in a wall I didn't know had a door." Ethan pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He looked at her across the table, across the same kitchen table where she'd sat 6 months ago with mascara on her cheeks and his oversized jacket and less than 12 hours to save her inheritance, and where Sophie's drawings were still on the refrigerator with the fruit-shaped magnets, and where the basil plant was still technically alive against all reasonable expectation. "You know what I think the codicil was actually about?" he said. "What?" "Not the marriage," he said. "The asking. That's the thing that changed. Not that you got married. I don't think he particularly cared about the legal status. He cared that you'd have to ask someone, that you'd have to say, 'I need help,' and mean it." He looked at her. "That's the thing you'd never done before." She was quiet for a moment. "You think you're very smart," she said finally. "I have my moments." "You're right," she said quietly. "That's exactly what it was." She looked at the legal pad, at the 47 names with their small human details. Then she closed the laptop. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. "I talked to my therapist last week about the marriage. About all of it, from the beginning. And she said something that I've been thinking about since." She met his eyes. "She said that the most significant thing I did wasn't showing up at your door. She said it was this, that when you got angry at me, in February, in March, I didn't leave. Every other time in my life when someone has confronted me about the way I operate, I've managed the situation. I've smoothed it over, or I've ended the relationship, or I've found some way to be somewhere else emotionally. She stopped. With you, I stayed, every time. And I didn't know until she said it out loud that that it was something I'd never done before. He looked at her. You stayed too, she said, when you had every reason not to. I told you, he said, not built for leaving. I know. She pressed her lips together. I just want you to know that it mattered, that it kept mattering. Every time you stayed, it changed something about how I thought about myself, about what I thought I was capable of. He didn't say anything for a moment. He was thinking about what she'd said, really thinking about it, the way it described something true about both of them. Two people who had learned to stay, each in their own way for their own reasons, and had found in each other someone worth staying for. You know what the actual thing is? He said. The lesson, or whatever you want to call it. What? It's not that love fixes things, he said. It's that love is what lets you fix things yourself. It's not, you don't stop being the person who has trouble staying. I don't stop being the person who builds walls around what he can't afford to lose. Those things don't just go away. He looked at her. But when you're in it with the right person, there's enough room to work on them. You've got someone who's watching and who's going to say something when you're slipping back, and you've got someone worth doing the work for. She was quiet. That's it, she said softly. That's the whole thing. Yeah. I feel like that should have been in a book somewhere. Probably is, he said. We just had to figure it out the hard way. She reached across the table and took his hand. September brought a new school year and Sophie's upgraded horse and dog drawing campaign, which had expanded to include a petition with 3 signatures, her own, and the elderly neighbors down the road, who had signed it enthusiastically and were now also asking about the dog situation. Vivian had been presented with the petition by Sophie with the gravity of a legal brief and had told Ethan privately that she found it very difficult to maintain a neutral position. She's going to win, Vivian said. I know, Ethan said. I've known since the first drawing. Then why are you still holding out? Because the moment you stop holding out is the moment the requests escalate. Ethan. She named the hypothetical dog Gerald. He lasted 3 more weeks. Then, on a Saturday in late September, almost exactly a year after the storm that had brought Vivian to his door, he drove Sophie to a rescue shelter 40 minutes away while Vivian pretended not to know where they were going. They came home with a brown dog of unclear parentage, medium-sized, approximately 2 years old, with ears that couldn't decide what direction they wanted to point. Sophie named him Gerald without hesitation or deliberation, as though the name had been waiting this whole time and the dog had finally shown up to claim it. Gerald was, immediately and completely, Sophie's dog. He followed her with the single-minded devotion that certain dogs have for certain children, the specific attunement of 2 beings that have found their person. And Sophie accepted this as her due and Gerald's great good fortune. When they got home, Vivian was on the back porch with her laptop. She looked up and saw Gerald, and then looked at Ethan with the expression of someone who had absolutely known this was going to happen, and was pretending otherwise for approximately 1 second. Who is this? She said. This is Gerald, Sophie said. He's ours. Gerald went directly to Vivian and put his head on her knee with the confidence of a dog who has already decided you're his people. She looked at him. Then she looked at Ethan, and the expression on her face was one he didn't have a precise word for. It was full and warm and slightly undone, the look of someone standing in a moment they hadn't known they were waiting for. She scratched Gerald behind the ears. Hi, Gerald, she said quietly. On the last Saturday of September, exactly 1 year after the storm, Ethan woke early the way he always did. The farm was changing into fall, the maples at the edge of the property going orange at the tips, the air cold in the mornings now, the particular slant of the light that meant the year was starting its slow lean toward winter. He went downstairs and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window. Sophie had stayed at a friend's house the night before, which was a relatively new development. She'd been uncertain about sleepovers for years and had finally, in the last month, decided she was ready, with the same decisive certainty she brought to all personal evolutions. Vivian came down at 6:30, barefoot, in the sweatpants that had never gone back to Vermont, and Gerald padded behind her with the loyalty of a dog who tracked her movements with the seriousness of a job. She came and stood beside him at the window. He handed her the coffee without turning around, and she took it and stood beside him, and they looked at the farm in the early morning October light, the fields, the barn, the fence he'd finally repaired properly in July, the maple trees going orange at the edges. "I've been thinking," she said. "Okay." "About the apartment in New York." She held the mug in both hands. "It doesn't feel like mine. It's never felt like mine. I've been there for 6 years, and I've never once felt like I was coming home when I walked in the door." He looked at her profile. "What does coming home feel like?" She looked at the window, at the October morning, the fields. Gerald had put his nose against the glass and left a mark that she didn't wipe away. "This," she said, "this feels like coming home." He put his arm around her. She leaned into it, the way she'd been learning to lean into things that felt like rest. "We should probably figure out the apartment then," he said. "Probably. You could keep it smaller, a work base, not a home base." "That's what I was thinking." She paused. "Martin will tell me I'm being impractical." "Are you?" She thought about it. "No. I'm being the opposite of impractical. I'm being very clear about what actually works and what I've been telling myself works because it was easier than admitting it didn't." He nodded. He knew that particular distinction, the gap between what you've arranged your life around and what you actually need, and the work of closing that gap without blowing everything up in the process. He'd learned it after Claire, in the slow project of rebuilding a life that was genuinely his rather than just the continuation of the one that had been interrupted. "The legal stuff," he said. "The marriage. What do you want to do about that?" She turned to look at him. "What do you want?" "I asked you first." She almost smiled. "I want it to be real," she said. "Not just legal. I mean, I want to choose it, properly. Not because a deadline forced us into it, not because of a codicil, not because of Damien, because we're choosing it." She held his gaze. "Are we choosing it?" He looked at her. At the woman who had driven through a storm to his door because he was the only person she trusted, who had made scrambled eggs and borrowed sweatpants, who had stood in a courthouse and held his daughter's hand without thinking about it, who had gotten angry at herself for her own failures instead of hiding them, who was scratching Gerald behind the ears with the look of someone who had found something she didn't know she'd been looking for. "Yeah," he said. "We're choosing it." She leaned up and kissed him, briefly and completely, the way you kiss someone when the question is finally settled and the answer is exactly what you hoped it would be. Outside, the October morning continued its business. The hens making their commentary from the coop, a crow calling from the maples, Gerald leaving another nose print on the window and then looking back at them with the satisfied expression of a dog who has correctly assessed his situation. Later that morning, when Sophie came home from her sleepover, she walked in the back door and found Vivian at the kitchen table with the legal pad, 59 names now, each with their human detail, and Ethan in the garden pulling the last of the kale before the frost, and Gerald sprawled on the kitchen floor in the exact middle of the space where a person would most need to walk, which was Gerald's preferred location. Sophie dropped her backpack on the bench by the door. She looked at the scene. Vivian at the table, Gerald on the floor, the sound of her father in the garden, with the comprehensive assessment she brought to the state of things. "Good," she said, to no one in particular. Then she stepped over Gerald and sat down across from Vivian and said, "Can you teach me French braids? Not to do to myself, to do to other people, because Maisie at school doesn't know how, and I want to be the person who knows." Vivian put down the pen. "Yes," she said. "I can teach you that." And so the morning went, the way mornings do. Ordinary and irreplaceable, the kind that don't announce their own importance until later, when you're looking back, and you understand that this was when everything had already become what it was going to be. A year earlier, a woman had knocked on a farmhouse door in a thunderstorm with less than 12 hours and no options, and a single fragile thing left to bet on, the trust of someone who had never asked anything from her. What happened next was not perfect. It was not clean. It was two people with specific and identifiable failures, a 7-year-old with strong opinions and a petition, a brown dog named Gerald, a farm in Vermont, a company in New York, and the slow, imperfect, genuine work of choosing each other in the ordinary light of ordinary days. Edgar Sterling had written 3 paragraphs in a document no one was supposed to find, in the hope that his granddaughter might finally learn one thing he hadn't been able to teach her himself, that the walls she'd built to protect what she had were the same walls that were keeping out everything she needed. He'd been right, and somewhere in a Vermont farmhouse, on a late September morning with frost on the fields and a dog on the floor and coffee on the counter, the thing he'd hoped for, not the marriage, not the company, but the opening, was simply and quietly and completely true. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in fact, everything.